Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Cargo That Breathes. From Marcus Sullivan. I've been hauling freight across the Southwest for nearly 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these desert highways could throw at me. Breakdowns in the middle of nowhere, flash floods that turn dry riverbeds into raging torrents, even the occasional coyote pack that gets a little too curious about what's in the trailer. But what happened last Tuesday on Route 285 through New Mexico still makes my hands shake when I think about it. The load seemed routine enough when I picked it up from a warehouse outside Albuquerque. The paperwork listed it as industrial refrigeration equipment bound for a facility in Carlsbad. The trailer was one of those specialized climate-controlled units, preset to maintain a steady 38 degrees. The warehouse crew seemed nervous, kept exchanging glances as they secured the doors, but warehouse folks are always a little odd, working those overnight shifts. I signed the papers, did my pre-trip inspection on my Kenworth W900, and headed south into the darkness. The first hour was peaceful, just me and the steady rumble of the diesel engine cutting through the high desert night. The stars were brilliant out there, away from the city lights, scattered across the sky like spilled diamonds on black velvet. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty asphalt and the occasional tumbleweed skittering across the road. The CB radio crackled with distant conversations between other drivers, their voices fading in and out like ghosts on the airwaves. It was around mile marker 47 when I first noticed something off. The temperature gauge for the trailer started fluctuating, dropping from 38 degrees to 35, then spiking up to 42 before settling back to normal. These units can be temperamental, especially the older ones, but this trailer was supposed to be brand new. I made a mental note to have it checked when I reached Carlsbad. Then came the sound. At first I thought it was just the refrigeration unit cycling, that familiar mechanical hum that becomes white noise after enough hours on the road. But this was different, rhythmic somehow, like breathing, deep, slow inhalations followed by long, whistling exhalations that seemed to sync with the rhythm of the truck's movement. I turned off the radio, rolled down my window to listen better. The desert wind whipped through the cab, carrying the scent of sage and dust, but underneath it all that breathing sound persisted. I pulled over at a rest area near Roswell, telling myself I was just being paranoid, that the long hours were playing tricks on my mind. The parking lot was empty except for a single RV with its lights off, probably some tourists getting an early start on their alien hunting adventure. I grabbed my flashlight and walked back to check the trailer, my boots crunching on the gravel. The refrigeration unit was running normally, its digital display showing a steady 38 degrees. I pressed my ear against the aluminum siding of the trailer and immediately pulled back. It was warm, almost body temperature, despite the cooling unit running full blast, and that breathing sound was definitely coming from inside, deep and patient, like something massive in hibernation. I should have called dispatch right then, should have demanded they send someone to check the cargo, but I had a deadline, and breaking seal on a trailer without authorization meant my job. So I convinced myself it was just the refrigeration coils, maybe some loose insulation creating an acoustic effect. I climbed back into the cab and continued south, watching the mile markers count down to Carlsbad. The radio started acting up around Artesia. Static would burst through the speakers in rhythmic pulses that matched that breathing sound from the trailer. Other drivers' voices would stretch and distort, their words becoming unintelligible moans that made my skin crawl. I switched it off and drove in silence, or what passed for silence with that constant respiration echoing from behind me. That's when the trailer started moving, not swaying from the wind or rocking from uneven road surfaces, but deliberate movement, like something inside was shifting its weight. The whole rig would pull slightly to the left, then correct to the right, as if whatever was in there was trying to find a more comfortable position. My mirrors showed nothing unusual, just the dark bulk of the trailer illuminated by my running lights, but I could feel it through the fifth wheel connection, a living presence that made the entire truck feel alive. The temperature gauge went haywire as I passed through the oil fields outside Carlsbad. It dropped to near freezing, frost actually forming on the inside of my windshield, then shot up so high the digital display just showed error messages. The breathing became labored, almost panting, and I swear I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck even though nothing was there. I was 10 miles from the delivery address when the trailer doors started rattling, not from wind or road vibration but from impact, like something inside was testing the locks. The sound was methodical, 3 heavy thumps, then silence, then 3 more. Whatever was in there had figured out the rhythm of the road and was timing its efforts between the rougher patches of asphalt where the sounds might go unnoticed. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel as I took the exit for the industrial district. The facility was at the end of a long access road, surrounded by chain link and razor wire. Security lights blazed in the darkness, and I've never been so relieved to see the glow of civilization. I pulled up to the guard shack, trying to keep my voice steady as I showed my paperwork. The guard looked at the documentation, then at me, his face going pale under the fluorescent lights. He made a quick phone call, speaking in hushed, urgent tones I couldn't quite make out. Within minutes, a team of people in white hazmat suits surrounded my truck, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. They directed me to back into a loading bay that looked more like an airlock than a normal dock, with thick rubber seals around the edges and warning signs in languages I didn't recognize. One of them, apparently the supervisor, approached my window. Through the suit's speaker, his voice sounded tinny and distant. He asked if I'd experienced any unusual symptoms during transport, if I'd heard or felt anything strange. I told him about the breathing, the movement, the temperature fluctuations. He nodded like none of this surprised him and handed me a clipboard with a non-disclosure agreement. The number at the bottom, what they were paying me to keep quiet, had more zeros than I'd ever seen. As I signed the papers, I watched in my mirrors as they opened the trailer. The breathing sound grew louder, filling the air like thunder, and for just a moment I saw something that shouldn't exist. It was massive, taking up the entire trailer, its surface rippling with each breath like water disturbed by wind. It had no definite shape, constantly flowing and reforming, but there were things within it that might have been eyes, hundreds of them, all different sizes, all blinking in unison. They closed the doors quickly, but not before that thing seemed to notice me watching. Every one of those eyes turned to look directly at me through the mirror, and I felt something touch my mind, just for an instant. It wasn't malevolent, exactly, more curious, like a child examining a new toy. But in that brief contact, I understood that this thing was old, older than the desert, older than anything that should exist in our world. I left that facility as fast as I could without seeming suspicious, drove straight through to Phoenix without stopping. I've turned down 3 loads going through New Mexico since then, making excuses about maintenance or family obligations. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through empty stretches of highway, I hear that breathing again, faint but unmistakable, like an echo trapped in the cab of my truck. The worst part is the dreams. In them I'm back in that moment when all those eyes turn to look at me, but this time the doors don't close. That thing flows out of the trailer like living darkness, spreading across the desert, breathing in rhythm with the earth itself. And I know, with the certainty that only comes in nightmares, that it's still out there somewhere, in some other trailer, on some other highway, waiting for another driver to carry it to its destination. I check the non-disclosure agreement sometimes, counting the years until it expires, wondering if anyone would believe me anyway. But mostly I just drive, keeping to the well-lit routes, avoiding the industrial districts, and trying not to think about what other cargo might be moving through the night, breathing in the darkness of 1,000 trailers, waiting to be delivered. The Atlas of Accusations, from Denise Hartley. I found the map tucked behind the sun visor of a used Freightliner Cascadia I just purchased from an auction lot in Ohio. The truck had belonged to an owner-operator who'd apparently just walked away from the business one day, left everything behind including personal effects. The auctioneer said the previous owner, a guy named Carl Brennan, had seemed increasingly agitated in his final weeks of driving, claimed his GPS was talking to him, telling him things. They figured it was exhaustion, maybe early onset dementia. I should have thrown that map away the moment I found it, but curiosity has always been my weakness. It was an old trucker's atlas, the kind we all used before GPS became standard. Pages yellowed and worn soft from handling. Coffee stains marked the corners, and someone had made notes in the margins with different colored pens, tracking routes through the Midwest like a spider's web of possibilities. Normal enough, except for the fact that every single note was written in what looked like different handwriting, as if dozens of people had contributed to this one atlas over the years. My first run with the Freightliner was a load of automotive parts from Cleveland to Kansas City, a route I'd driven 50 times before. I had my phone mounted on the dash, GPS running like always, but something made me flip open that atlas to the Ohio page. That's when I heard it for the first time. Just a whisper, really, barely audible over the engine noise. It sounded like someone clearing their throat, preparing to speak. I turned down the radio, listened harder, but heard nothing more. The weather was turning ugly as I crossed into Indiana, thick clouds rolling in from the north promising snow. I stopped at a truck stop near Fort Wayne to grab coffee and check the weather reports. The atlas lay open on my passenger seat, and when I climbed back into the cab, it had flipped itself to the Indiana page. I know how that sounds, but I'm telling you that book was showing Ohio when I left it. The margin notes on the Indiana page were frantic, overlapping each other in a tangle of warnings about specific mile markers, certain exits to avoid, times of night when particular stretches of highway became dangerous. That's when the shouting started. Not immediately, but gradually, building from that whisper I'd heard earlier. First it was just someone mumbling directions, voice muffled like it was coming through water. Then it got clearer, louder, more insistent. A man's voice, rough from years of cigarettes and coffee, telling me I was going the wrong way, that I needed to turn around immediately. The voice seemed to come from the atlas itself, vibrating up through the pages and filling the cab with its urgency. I pulled over on the shoulder, hands shaking as I picked up the atlas. The moment my fingers touched the pages, the voice became crystal clear, like someone was sitting right beside me. But it wasn't giving me directions anymore. It was accusing me of things, terrible things I'd never done. It knew my name, knew where I lived, knew about the divorce I'd just gone through. It told me I was a failure, that I'd abandoned my family just like Carl Brennan had abandoned his truck. The voice said I was following his route exactly, that I'd end up just like him. I threw the atlas into the sleeper berth and kept driving. But the voice didn't stop. It grew louder with each mile, switching between different speakers like a radio scanning through stations. A woman's voice joined in, shrill and accusing, saying I'd stolen her husband's truck, that I had no right to be driving it. Then a child's voice, asking why I'd left them at that rest stop, why I'd driven away. None of it was true, none of it made sense, but the accusations burrowed into my mind like parasites. The snow started falling heavy as I crossed into Illinois, visibility dropping to almost nothing. The GPS kept recalculating, trying to route me around the weather, but every time it suggested a detour, the atlas would scream objections. It said the GPS was lying, that it was leading me into a trap. The pages started flipping on their own, faster and faster, creating a wind inside the cab that shouldn't have been possible. Each page that turned brought new voices, new accusations, a chorus of anger that made my head feel like it was splitting apart. I needed to stop, needed to think, so I pulled into a rest area near Bloomington. The moment I parked, the atlas went silent. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the shouting. Like the calm before a tornado, I grabbed the book, intent on throwing it in the trash. But when I opened it, I saw something that made my blood freeze. There was a new note in the margin of the Illinois page, written in handwriting I recognized as my own, describing this exact rest area, this exact moment, warning someone not to stop here. The parking lot was empty except for my truck, and a few cars covered in snow. I walked to the restroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to make sense of what was happening. When I returned to the truck, the driver's door was open, snow already accumulating on the seat. The atlas was now on the steering wheel, open to a page I'd never seen before. It wasn't part of the original book, but somehow inserted between Illinois and Indiana, showing a map that couldn't exist. The map showed roads that weren't on any official atlas, highways that curved in impossible directions, intersections that seemed to fold in on themselves. Cities were marked with names I'd never heard of, dates that hadn't happened yet, or had happened centuries ago, and there, highlighted in fresh red ink, was a route that led off the edge of the page, into nothing. The voices started again, but calmer now, almost seductive, telling me this was the route I was meant to take, that all the accusations would stop if I just followed this one special path. I got back in the truck, closed the door against the howling wind, and started the engine. The GPS showed I-74 clear ahead despite the snow, a straight shot to Iowa. But the Atlas was insistent, the voices rising again. Not shouting now but pleading, begging me to take the exit that would lead to that impossible They promised answers, promised peace, promised I'd understand everything if I just trusted them this once. The exit they wanted me to take didn't exist on the GPS, but as I approached mile marker 35, I saw it there in the swirling snow, a ramp that seemed to materialize just for me. The sign was rusted, unreadable, pointing toward darkness. Every instinct told me to keep driving, to stay on the known highway, but the Atlas was screaming now, not with words but with raw sound that made my teeth ache and my eyes water. I white-knuckled past that exit, fighting the urge to turn the wheel. The moment I passed it, the Atlas burst into flames. Not normal fire, but something cold and blue that didn't actually burn the page. Through the flames I could see faces in the map. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. All twisted in rage and disappointment. The heat was freezing, if that makes sense, making ice form on the inside of the windshield even as flames licked at the ceiling of the cab. I grabbed the burning Atlas with my bare hands, the cold fire sending shooting pains up my arms, and threw it out the window into the snowy darkness. It hit the highway and exploded into 1,000 pieces of frozen paper that scattered in the wind like ash. In my mirrors I watched those pieces swirl up into the snow clouds, forming shapes that might have been faces, might have been hands reaching after my truck, before disappearing into the storm. The rest of the drive to Kansas City was silent except for the normal sounds of the truck and the weather. The GPS worked perfectly, leading me through the storm without issue. But when I arrived at the delivery dock and went to log my hours, I found something that still haunts me. My logbook showed an extra 3 hours on this trip, time I couldn't account for. The GPS history showed a gap in my route, a blank spot where I'd apparently been nowhere for those 3 missing hours. I've since sold that Freightliner, took a loss on it just to be rid of it. The new owner called me a few weeks later, asked if I'd left anything in the truck. He said he'd found an old Atlas behind the sun visor, wondered if I wanted it back. I told him to burn it, really burn it, with actual fire. He laughed, said he'd just throw it away. I haven't heard from him since, and when I tried calling the number he'd used, it was disconnected. Sometimes now when I'm driving late at night with just my phone GPS for company, I hear whispers in the electronic voice giving me direction. They're not accusations exactly, more like suggestions, trying to guide me toward exits that my GPS insists don't exist. I keep driving straight, always straight, never trusting any voice that promises shortcuts or special routes, because I know now that some maps don't just show you the way, they try to make you become part of them. Another voice in the chorus, another warning written in the margins for the next driver to find. I looked up Carl Brennan once, the previous owner of that Freightliner. There's no record of him anywhere after he walked away from that truck. It's like he simply stopped existing. But sometimes on very quiet nights, when I'm passing through Illinois in the snow, I swear I can hear his voice on the CB radio, warning drivers about an exit that doesn't exist, begging them not to pick up any maps they might find, not to listen when the pages start to shout. The grip that wouldn't let go. From Raymond Torres. I've been running freight through the Pacific Northwest for 23 years, and I thought I knew every truck stop, every modification shop, and every sketchy character trying to make a quick buck off desperate drivers. But that place I stumbled into outside Car Dalene last month, during that freak ice storm, that was something else entirely. I still wake up at night, feeling like my truck is driving up my bedroom wall, defying every law of physics I thought I understood. The storm hit sudden and hard while I was hauling a load of lumber from Spokane to Missoula. Black ice turned Interstate 90 into a skating rink, and my worn Michelins weren't getting any kind of purchase on the road. I was sliding more than driving, watching other rigs jackknife into the median, when I saw the sign for Earl's emergency tire service. Exit now. Next right. I didn't remember any tire shop at this exit from my previous runs, but when you're fighting to keep 40 tons of lumber from becoming a projectile, you don't question providence. The shop sat in a narrow valley between two steep hills, almost hidden from the highway by a thick stand of Douglas firs. It was an old corrugated metal building, the kind they threw up in the 60s, with a single bay door glowing warm yellow against the storm. A hand-painted sign promised 24-hour service. Any tire, any size, any condition. The parking lot was empty, except for a few old truck carcasses rusting along the fence line, their wheels missing, sitting on blocks like mechanical skeletons. Earl himself came out before I'd even set my brakes, a thin man in coveralls, so oil-stained they looked like camouflage. He had the kind of gaunt face you see on old-timers who've spent too many years breathing diesel fumes and tire rubber, but his eyes were sharp, almost too bright in the dim stormlight. He took one look at my tires and shook his head, making a clicking sound with his tongue that somehow carried over the wind. He said he had something special, something that would get me through any weather, any road condition. Called them his climbing grade specials. Said they were military surplus from some project that got canceled, something about all-terrain vehicles that never made it to production. The price was reasonable, suspiciously so, but when you're looking at being stuck in an ice storm for who knows how long, you don't haggle. I told him to put them on while I grabbed coffee from the machine in his office. The office was cramped and strange, filled with photographs of trucks in impossible positions. There was a semi driving straight up a cliff face, another one somehow wrapped around a tree trunk like a snake, its wheels gripping bark. I figured they were doctored photos, some kind of artistic thing, maybe Earl's way of showing off his Photoshop skills. The coffee was bitter and had an aftertaste like rubber, but it was hot, and that's all that mattered right then. When I came back out, Earl was just finishing up, and I got my first good look at the new tires. They were black, but not the normal black of rubber. These seemed to absorb light, creating shadows that moved independent of any light source. The tread pattern was unlike anything I'd seen before, intricate spirals that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, creating an optical illusion that made my eyes water. When I touched one, it felt warm, almost alive, and I swear I felt a pulse running through it. Earl told me these tires would grip anything, absolutely anything, but there were rules. Never exceed 70 miles per hour, never drive them in direct sunlight for more than 6 hours straight, and most importantly, never ever try to remove them myself. When they wore out, which he promised wouldn't be for at least 100,000 miles, I was to come back to him and only him. I laughed at the strange requirements, but Earl didn't smile. He just handed me the receipt and told me to be careful what I wished for. The difference was immediate and unsettling. My Peterbilt didn't just grip the ice. It seemed to bond with it, like the tires were reaching through the surface to grab the asphalt underneath. The truck felt different too, lighter somehow, like gravity had loosened its hold just a little. I made it through the pass without any trouble, delivered my lumber on schedule, and figured that was the end of it. Just some weird tires from an eccentric old mechanic. But then things started getting strange. It happened first at a loading dock in Seattle. I was backing into a tight spot between two other trucks when my rear wheels hit the wall. Instead of stopping, they started climbing it. I felt the back of my truck lift, saw it in my mirrors, the trailer tilting upward as the tires found purchase on vertical concrete. I slammed the brakes, shifted to drive, and pulled forward before anyone noticed, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. After that, it kept happening. The tires would grip things they shouldn't, pull the truck in directions that defied physics. Driving through a construction zone, they'd catch on the concrete barriers and try to climb them. Passing under overpasses, I'd feel them tugging upward, wanting to scale the support pillars. It was like they had a mind of their own, constantly searching for new surfaces to conquer. The worst incident happened 3 weeks ago on a lonely stretch of Highway 97 through Central Oregon. It was just past midnight, no other traffic for miles, when I felt the truck pulling toward the canyon wall beside the road. Before I could react, the passenger side tires had caught the rock face and started climbing. The whole rig tilted sickeningly as the tires crawled up the cliff, defying gravity with their impossible grip. I fought the wheel, trying to steer back toward the road, but the tires wouldn't let go. They kept climbing, pulling the truck up at a 45-degree angle, then steeper. Tools and paperwork tumbled from the dashboard. My coffee mug shattered against the passenger window, and I could hear the lumber in my trailer shifting, straining against the straps. The headlights pointed uselessly at the sky, leaving me driving by the dim glow of the dash lights. We must have climbed 50 feet before the tires finally released their grip, whether from my frantic steering or their own mysterious logic. I don't know. The truck fell backward, and for a terrifying moment, I thought we were going to flip completely over. But somehow, the tires caught the cliff again on the way down, controlling our descent like a spider rappelling down a web. We hit the asphalt hard but upright, the suspension groaning, the trailer swaying dangerously before settling. I pulled over at the next wide spot, hands shaking so bad I could barely put it in park. When I got out to inspect the damage, I found something that made no sense. The tires showed no wear from climbing solid rock, not a single scuff or scratch, but there were marks on them that hadn't been there before. Patterns in the rubber that looked almost like fingerprints, as if invisible hands had been pressing into them, guiding them up that cliff. I've tried everything to get them off. Took it to 3 different tire shops, but the lug nuts won't budge. They're not stripped or rusted, they just won't turn, like they're fused to the wheel. One mechanic brought out a cutting torch, but the moment the flame touched the rubber, it went out, just extinguished like someone had flipped a switch. Another tried to jack up the truck to get better leverage, but the tires wouldn't leave the ground, gripping so tight they actually pulled the jack through the asphalt. The GPS has started acting strange too, trying to route me down roads that don't exist, paths that according to the maps would take me straight up mountainsides or across lakes. Sometimes at night, parked at rest stops, I feel the truck moving slightly, a gentle rocking like the tires are testing their grip, eager to climb something, anything. I've started chaining the wheels when I sleep, but I wake up to find the chains snapped, discarded beside the truck like broken toys. I tried to find Earl's shop again last week, drove that same exit outside Cordell Lane, but it's not there. The valley is there, the trees are there, but where the shop should be is just an empty field, overgrown with blackberry vines like nothing's been there for decades. I asked at the nearest town, but nobody's heard of Earl's emergency tire service. They looked at me like I was crazy when I described it. The tires are getting stronger, more insistent. Yesterday, driving through Portland, they tried to climb the side of a parking garage while I was at a red light. People were filming with their phones, probably thinking it was some kind of stunt. I had to run the light to break free, adding a traffic violation to my growing list of problems. The company's asking questions about the damage to the trailer, about the complaints from other drivers who've seen my truck in impossible places. I've got 17 more deliveries scheduled this month. 17 more chances for these tires to decide they want to go vertical, or maybe try something worse. I've started having dreams where I wake up on my ceiling, the truck somehow driven up my apartment building and through my bedroom wall, tires gripping the plaster, engine still running. In the dreams, Earl is there, smiling that thin smile, telling me I got exactly what I asked for, tires that would grip anything, absolutely anything. The receipt he gave me has changed too. Where it used to list the price and service, now it just has a single line of text that seems to be written in my own handwriting, though I know I never wrote it. It says the road goes wherever the wheels can grip, and the wheels can grip everything. Below that is a date, 6 weeks from now, and a location, coordinates that when I looked them up show a spot high on Mount Hood, a place no road could possibly reach. I think that's where they want to go, where these tires are ultimately trying to take me. Every day the pull gets stronger, the attempts to leave the road more frequent. I've thought about abandoning the truck, just walking away like Carl Brennan did, but I have a feeling the tires would find me, that I'd wake up one morning to find my Peterbilt parked vertically against my apartment building, 18 wheels gripping the brick, waiting for me to climb in and let them take me where they want to go. So I keep driving, fighting them every mile, hoping that somehow I'll find Earl's shop again, or that they'll finally wear out, though they show no signs of wear, despite the impossible things they've done. And late at night when I'm alone on empty highways, I sometimes stop fighting for just a moment, curious to see where they'd take me if I let them. But then I remember those photos in Earl's office, the trucks wrapped around trees, driving up cliffs, and I grip the wheel tighter, point the hood ornament straight ahead, and pretend that the laws of physics still apply to me and my climbing tire. I inherited my grandfather's 1987 Mac R model, after he passed last spring, a classic old bulldog that he'd maintained like a temple for 32 years. He'd driven it right up until the week before his heart gave out, and even though I had my own newer rig, something about that old truck called to me. Maybe it was sentiment, maybe it was the pristine condition he'd kept it in, or maybe it was just the way it still smelled like his pipe tobacco and coffee. I should have left it parked as a memorial, but I decided to restore it completely and put it back into service, hauling specialty cargo through the mountain routes of Colorado and Wyoming. The restoration went smoothly until I got to the dashboard. Most of it was original and perfect, that classic arrangement of analog gauges and toggle switches that they don't make anymore. But there was one gauge I'd never seen before, installed where the clock should have been. It was about 3 inches across, with a black face and no numbers, just a thin red line that ran horizontally across the center. Grandfather had never mentioned it, and it wasn't in any of the maintenance records. The mechanic at the restoration shop said it looked like some kind of aftermarket monitor, maybe for exhaust temperature or oil pressure, though it wasn't connected to anything he could identify. I decided to keep it, figuring it was something grandfather had installed for a reason. The first time I started the truck after the restoration, that gauge did nothing, just showed that flat red line like a dead EKG. But as the engine warmed up, something changed. The line began to pulse, just slightly at first, a gentle wave that matched the rhythm of the diesel engine. It was almost hypnotic, that soft red glow pulsing in the darkness of the early morning cab. My first run in the restored Mac was a load of medical equipment from Denver to Casper, a route grandfather had run hundreds of times. I knew every curve, every grade, every truck stop along that stretch of I-25. The truck handled beautifully, that old Detroit diesel singing its familiar song, the Jake brake barking just like I remembered from when I was a kid, riding shotgun with grandfather. But that gauge kept drawing my attention, its pulsing growing more pronounced as we climbed into the mountains. It was near the Owl Canyon exit when I first noticed the pattern had changed. The gauge wasn't following the engine rhythm anymore. It had developed its own cadence, steady and measured, about 70 beats per minute. It took me a moment to realize what I was seeing, and when I did, I had to pull over to check. I pressed my fingers to my wrist, counting my own pulse, watching the gauge. They matched perfectly. That red line was pulsing in sync with my heartbeat. I sat there on the shoulder for 20 minutes, experimenting. When I did jumping jacks beside the truck, the gauge sped up. When I sat quietly and practiced the meditation breathing my therapist had taught me, it slowed down. Somehow that gauge had connected to me, was monitoring my vital signs like a medical monitor. It should have been impossible, but there it was, pulsing red in the dashboard, keeping perfect time with my heart. The rational part of my mind said to disconnect it immediately, but curiosity won out. It wasn't hurting anything, and there was something oddly comforting about seeing my heartbeat displayed there, proof that I was alive and present in grandfather's truck. I continued the run to Casper, delivered the medical equipment on schedule, and loaded up for the return trip, this time with agricultural supplies. That's when things started getting strange. Driving back through the mountains at dusk, the gauge began showing irregularity. The red line would occasionally spike, creating sharp peaks that didn't match my heartbeat. At first I thought it was malfunctioning, But then I noticed the spikes happened at specific locations. They were strongest near accident sites, places where I could see tire marks veering off the road, or scattered pieces of reflector plastic in the grass. The gauge was picking up something else, some other rhythm layered beneath my own. The worst was near the Laramie exit, where a trucker had died in a jackknife accident the previous winter. I'd known him slightly, a guy named Foster, who ran the same routes I did. As I passed the spot where he'd gone off the road, the gauge went crazy, the red line fragmenting into multiple pulses, like several heartbeats all running at different speeds. I could feel them somehow, ghost rhythms in my chest, the panic of final moments preserved in that stretch of asphalt. I started avoiding known accident sites after that, taking alternate routes when possible, but the gauge continued its strange behavior. Sometimes late at night on empty highways, it would show two heartbeats, mine and another one, slightly slower, slightly stronger. It felt familiar, that second rhythm, like a song I'd heard before, but couldn't quite place. It would fade in and out, stronger when I was tired, almost absent when I was fully alert. The revelation came 3 weeks later at a truck stop near Cheyenne. I was parked for my mandatory rest period, lying in the sleeper berth, watching the gauge pulse in the darkness. An old-timer knocked on my door, said he'd recognized the truck, asked if I was related to Nakamura, who used to run this route. When I told him I was his granddaughter, his face went soft with memory. He told me about my grandfather's last run, how he'd looked tired but determined, how he'd mentioned his heart had been feeling funny, but he had one more load to deliver. That's when I understood. The second heartbeat the gauge sometimes showed, that familiar rhythm, it was grandfather's. Somehow his final drives, his last weeks in this truck, had imprinted on that gauge. It was playing back his heartbeat like an echo, strongest in the places he'd driven most often, the routes that had been his life for over 3 decades. The gauge wasn't just monitoring me, it was remembering him. I started paying closer attention to when his rhythm appeared. It was strongest on the stretches of road he'd loved most, the high mountain passes where you could see for 50 miles, the quiet valleys where elk grazed beside the highway. But it would also spike near truck stops where he'd had coffee every morning, or that one scenic overlook where he'd always stop to eat lunch and watch the clouds roll over the Rockies. His heart, or the memory of it, was mapping his favorite places, showing me the geography of his life through that pulsing red line. But the gauge began picking up other rhythms too, heartbeats that weren't mine or grandfather's. Driving past hospitals, it would fragment into dozens of different pulses, some racing with panic, others slow and fading. Near retirement homes, it would show the steady, tired rhythms of hearts that had been beating for 8 or 9 decades. Once, passing a school, it exploded into a chaos of quick, hummingbird-fast pulses, the hyperactive hearts of children at play. The most disturbing incident happened last Tuesday on Highway 287, near the Wyoming border. It was just past 3 in the morning, that dead time when the darkness feels heaviest and the white lines blur together. The gauge suddenly flatlined, that red line going completely straight and still. My own heart was beating normally. I could feel it, but the gauge showed nothing. Then, slowly, a new pulse emerged. But it was wrong somehow. Too slow, too deep, like something massive and ancient stirring to life. The cab grew cold, despite the heater running full blast, and frost spread across the inside of the windshield, in patterns that looked like circulatory systems, branching veins of ice. That deep, wrong pulse on the gauge grew stronger, and I began to feel it in my chest, competing with my own heartbeat, trying to override it. My hands moved on their own, turning the wheel toward the shoulder, toward the darkness beyond the road. The speedometer climbed, even though I wasn't pressing the accelerator, the truck pulling toward something off in the plains. It was grandfather's rhythm that saved me. His heartbeat suddenly flared on the gauge, fast and strong like I'd never seen it, overlaying that ancient pulse with its familiar pattern. I could almost hear his voice telling me to downshift, to brake, to fight whatever was trying to take control. I followed that memory, that ghost rhythm, and managed to stop the truck, just before it would have plunged down an embankment into a ravine that shouldn't have been there, that didn't show on any map. When I looked back, the ravine was gone, just flat prairie stretching to the horizon. But the gauge showed the truth. 3 distinct heartbeats now, mine racing with fear. Grandfather's steady and protective, and that other thing, that deep, wrong pulse, fading but not gone, waiting at the edges of the red line for another chance. I've tried to remove the gauge several times since then, but the wiring disappears into the dashboard in ways that make no sense, seeming to merge with the truck's electrical system at a molecular level. When I had a mechanic look at it, he said the wires appeared to be made of some kind of organic material, almost like veins or nerve fibers. He refused to touch them after that, said some things weren't meant to be understood. So I keep driving grandfather's routes, watching that red gauge pulse with multiple heartbeats. Mine is always there, the baseline, the proof I'm still alive and in control. Grandfather's comes and goes, strongest when I need guidance, when the road gets dangerous, or when that other pulse tries to emerge. And there are others now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, every person who's ever driven this truck, or passed close to it, their rhythms recorded in that impossible gauge. Late at night when I'm parked at rest stops, I sometimes sit and watch the gauge cycle through its catalog of heartbeats. Young ones full of hope and energy, old ones worn but steady, and some that aren't quite human at all. It's becoming a kind of music, a symphony of pulses that tells the story of every mile this truck has traveled. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear something in those rhythms, a message in the pattern that might be grandfather trying to tell me something, warn me about something that's coming. The gauge showed me a vision last night, or maybe a memory, or maybe a prophecy. In it, every vehicle on every highway had one of these gauges, all of them connected, creating a vast network of heartbeats spanning the entire country. And at the center of it all was that ancient, wrong pulse, growing stronger, using our rhythms to map our locations, our fears, our final moment. I don't know if it's a warning or if it's already too late, but I keep driving, watching the red line pulse, adding my heartbeat to the collection, hoping that grandfather's rhythm will always be strong enough to protect me from whatever that gauge is really monitoring. The red pulsing never stops now, even when the truck is off. It sits there in the darkness of the garage, beating like a heart that refuses to die, collecting rhythms from anyone who passes by. And sometimes in the deepest part of the night, I swear I can hear actual heartbeats coming from the dashboard, the sound of all those collected pulses, trying to become something more than memory, trying to become alive again through that softly glowing red line. From Marcus Chen. I picked her up at a truck stop outside Bakersfield, though picked up isn't quite right. One moment my passenger seat was empty, the next she was there like she'd always been there, like she'd been waiting in that seat since the truck rolled off the assembly line. No door opening, no climbing in, just suddenly there in my peripheral vision, as I merged back onto I-5, heading north with a load of almonds bound for Portland. She looked normal enough at first glance, just a woman in her 30s wearing a faded denim jacket and jeans that had seen better days. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a ponytail, and she stared straight ahead through the windshield with eyes that never seemed to blink. I should have slammed on the brakes, should have demanded to know how she got in, but something about her presence made those reactions feel impossible, like trying to scream in a dream. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the cab became after she appeared. The constant rumble of the diesel engine faded to a whisper, then to nothing. I could still feel the vibration through the seat, could see the RPM gauge showing normal readings, but the sound was gone, consumed by something. The road noise disappeared too, that constant white noise of tires on asphalt that becomes a trucker's lullaby. Even the wind rushing past the windows fell silent, leaving only a vacuum that made my ears pop and ring. I tried to speak, to ask who she was, what she wanted, but when I opened my mouth, no sound came out. I could feel my vocal cords moving, feel the air pushing from my lungs. But she turned her head slightly toward me, and I watched my words disappear into her, like she was inhaling them before they could form. Her mouth never opened, but I could see her throat move slightly, swallowing the sounds I was trying to make. The radio went next. I reached for it, hoping music or chatter might break whatever spell she'd cast, but the moment I turned it on, she leaned toward it slightly. The speakers produced nothing, not even static, though the display showed it was tuned and receiving signal. She was eating the noise before it could reach my ears, consuming every decibel like some kind of acoustic vampire. I kept driving because what else could I do? We passed through the Central Valley in absolute silence, the world outside moving like a silent film. Other truckers tried to hail me on the CB. I could see their lips moving through their windows as we passed, but their voices never reached me. She absorbed it all, growing somehow more solid with each sound she consumed, like she was building herself from stolen noise. The sun set behind us as we climbed the Siskiyou Pass, and in the darkness I began to see what she really was. In the dim green glow of the dashboard lights, her edges weren't quite right. They flickered and wavered like bad reception, and through the gaps I could see things that shouldn't exist. Mouths, dozens of them, opening and closing in silent hunger along her arms, her neck, behind her ear. Each one was perfectly formed, but wrong-sized, baby mouths and adult mouths, and some that looked too wide to be human, all of them feeding on the silence they created. She must have noticed me staring because she turned to face me fully for the first time. Her face was still normal, pretty even, but her eyes were pools of absolute silence, darker than the night outside, deeper than any shadow. Looking into them was like falling into a void where sound had never existed, where the very concept of noise was foreign and impossible. I jerked my gaze back to the road, my hands trembling on the wheel. The truck stop at Weed should have been my salvation. Bright lights, dozens of people. Surely someone would help, or at least witness this impossibility. But as I pulled into the lot, she shifted in her seat, and a bubble of silence expanded from her like a shock wave. I watched a driver drop his coffee cup, saw his mouth open in surprise, but heard nothing. A dog barked silently at us through a car window. The diesel pumps ran without their characteristic rumble. I parked and tried to get out, but she reached over and touched my arm. Her fingers were cold, colder than anything living should be, and where she touched me, I felt sounds being pulled from my body. My heartbeat, which I hadn't even been consciously aware of, went silent. The rush of blood in my ears stopped, even the subtle sounds of breathing, swallowing, the tiny noises our bodies make just by existing. All of them flowed into her through that touch. The sensation was horrifying, but also strangely peaceful, like drowning in calm water. I could feel myself becoming less real, less present, as if sound was what anchored me to existence, and without it I might just fade away. She held on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, then released me. My sounds rushed back like air into a vacuum, leaving me gasping and dizzy. She pointed at the road ahead, a clear message to keep driving. I obeyed, pulling back onto I-5, continuing north in our bubble of impossible silence. As we drove, I began to understand the pattern. She fed more heavily near certain places, hospitals, schools, anywhere people gathered and made noise. But she avoided others, actually seeming to shrink back from churches and cemeteries, as if those places had their own silence she couldn't or wouldn't consume. Near Eugene, something changed. She began to make noise herself, but it wasn't coming from her mouth. The sounds emerged from all those hidden mouths I'd glimpsed, a chorus of everything she'd eaten. I heard my own voice asking who she was, the coffee cup breaking at the truck stop, the dog barking, all of it playing back in reverse, distorted and wrong. It was like she was digesting the sounds, breaking them down into something else. Then came voices I didn't recognize, older sounds from meals she'd eaten before me, truckers begging to be let go, children crying for their parents, machinery screaming as it broke down, sirens that started as emergencies and ended as whispers, years of consumed noise pouring out in a twisted symphony that made my skull feel like it might crack. She was showing me her collection, her harvest from who knows how many vehicles, how many victims. The worst part was when I heard my grandfather's voice. He'd been a trucker too, had actually driven this same route before he died of a heart attack 5 years ago. But there was his voice, clear as day, praying in Vietnamese, the same prayer he'd taught me as a kid for protection on long journeys. She'd been in his truck, had fed on his final words, had saved them like some horrible souvenir. I wanted to crash the truck, to end this nightmare, but my hands wouldn't obey. She had eaten those impulses too, consumed my will to resist. Before I could act on it, we drove through Portland without stopping, my delivery forgotten, continuing north toward Seattle. The city lights reflected off her skin, which I could now see was just a covering, like clothes made of silence wrapped around something much worse. As we crossed the Columbia River, she began to fade, becoming translucent like morning mist. But she wasn't leaving. She was spreading, seeping into the truck itself. I watched her dissolve into the seats, the dashboard, the walls of the cab, until every surface had absorbed a piece of her. The silence remained, but now it came from everywhere. The entire truck had become her mouth, feeding on every sound I made. I drove for 3 more hours before I realized we'd left the highway entirely. We were on roads that didn't exist on any map, paths through forests that looked too old, too dark, too quiet even for her appetite. Finally, we stopped at a place where dozens of trucks sat abandoned, all different makes and models, all from different decades. Their drivers were still in them. I could see them through the windshields, moving their mouths in silent screams, honking horns that made no sound, trapped in their cabs by the thing that had eaten their noise. She reformed in my passenger seat, solid again, and smiled for the first time. When her lips parted, I saw that her mouth went deeper than should be possible, a tunnel of darkness lined with all those other mouths, leading somewhere that had never known sound. She gestured for me to get out, to join the other drivers in their silent imprisonment. But then something impossible happened. My phone, which had been dead silent like everything else, suddenly erupted with noise. An emergency alert, the kind that overrides all settings, screaming about a child abduction in the area. The sound was so sudden, so loud in the supernatural quiet, that she jerked back, her form rippling. The alert kept repeating, that harsh electronic tone cutting through her silence like a blade. She couldn't eat it fast enough. The digital sound was different somehow, harder for her to digest. I grabbed the phone, turned the volume higher, and played everything I could. Alarms, sirens, the most discordant music I could find. She writhed in the seat, those hidden mouths gasping and choking on the electronic cacophony. The silence bubble collapsed, and suddenly the world roared back into existence. The sound of 40 diesel engines starting at once was deafening. The other truckers, freed from their silent prisons, were fleeing in every direction. I threw the truck in reverse, my phone still screaming its digital chaos, and got out of there before she could recover. In my mirrors I saw her standing in the clearing, her form dispersing and reforming, trying to chase us but unable to maintain cohesion with so much sudden noise. I drove straight through to Los Angeles, afraid to stop, afraid of quiet places. I keep the radio on constantly now, multiple devices playing different sounds at all times. I've installed speakers in every corner of the cab, creating a wall of noise that never stops. Other truckers think I'm crazy, driving with that cacophony, but it's the only thing that keeps her away. Sometimes, though, in the gap between songs, in that split second of silence when I'm changing stations, I feel her presence. She's still there somewhere in the truck's bones, waiting for me to let my guard down, to embrace silence again. I see her in my peripheral vision at quiet truck stops, standing by the pumps, that hungry smile on her face. She's patient. I know she's eaten the sounds of centuries, and she can wait a little longer for mine. The worst part is, sometimes I want to let her. The constant noise is exhausting, and there are moments when the silence she offers seems like peace, like rest, like an end to all the chaos and racket of the world. But then I remember those trapped drivers, their mouths moving in eternal silent screams, and I turn the volume up higher, adding my noise to the world's symphony, staying loud, staying alive, staying just out of reach of the passenger who eats noise. From Teresa Blackwood, I found the rearview mirror at a swap meet in Amarillo, searching for a replacement after mine cracked on a particularly rough stretch of road near the Oklahoma border. The vendor was an old woman who dealt exclusively in trucking accessories from rigs that had been totaled or abandoned. She had boxes of gauges, CB radios, mud flaps with faded chrome silhouettes, and there, wrapped in yellowed newspaper from 1983, was the mirror that would change everything. It looked pristine for its age, a heavy rectangular piece with an ornate silver frame that seemed too fancy for a commercial vehicle. The glass was perfectly clear, not a single scratch or spot of oxidation, and it had a weight to it that felt substantial, important somehow. The woman sold it to me for $5, seemed eager to get rid of it actually, and threw in the mounting hardware for free. She warned me to only install it during daylight, though she wouldn't say why. I ignored her advice, of course. That night, parked at a Love's outside Fort Worth, with a load of electronics bound for Atlanta, I installed the mirror by the light of my headlamp. The moment it clicked into place, something felt different about the cab. The air seemed denser, like the space had somehow expanded while staying the same size. When I looked into the mirror, my reflection was perfect, clearer than any mirror I'd ever owned. But there was something else. For just a moment I could have sworn I saw myself twice, one reflection slightly behind the other, like a double exposure. The first multiplication happened 3 days later, on I-20, heading through Louisiana. It was that drowsy hour just before dawn when the highway hypnosis really sets in, when your eyes play tricks and every shadow could be something crossing the road. I glanced in the mirror to check my blind spot and saw two identical white Freightliners behind me where I knew there had only been one. They moved in perfect synchronization, their turn signals blinking in unison, their drivers visible as matching silhouettes in the dim cab lights. I checked my side mirrors, then turned to look directly through the back window. One truck, just one, exactly where it should be. But in the rear view, there were definitely two, and as I watched, a third materialized, appearing like it had always been there, following the same path, the same distance apart, a perfect convoy of replicas. My hands tightened on the wheel as I forced myself to look forward, to focus on the road ahead, but that mirror kept pulling my attention back. By the time the sun came up, the mirror showed 7 identical Freightliners, all perfectly spaced, all driven by the same shadowy figure. But the really unsettling part was, when the original truck took an exit, in reality, it turned off and disappeared down the ramp. In the mirror, only one of the 7 took the exit. The other 6 continued following me, ghost trucks that existed only in that reflection, maintaining their distance with mechanical precision. The multiplications weren't limited to vehicles. Outside Meridian, I watched a single highway patrol car become a fleet in the mirror. 8 cops, all running the same speed trap, all pulling over different vehicles that in reality were simply passing by unbothered. Near Birmingham, one road construction worker became a dozen, all operating the same jackhammer in slightly different positions, creating a strange stuttering effect, like time-lapse photography playing simultaneously. But it was at night when the mirror became truly terrifying. The darkness seemed to accelerate the multiplication effect. A single pair of headlights would become a constellation, an endless stream of lights that turned the mirror into a galaxy of approaching vehicles. Sometimes they weren't all the same anymore. Whatever was behind me would multiply into different versions of itself, older models, newer ones, variations that shouldn't exist, all sharing the road in that impossible reflection. The worst night was in the mountains of Tennessee. I was climbing Monteagle in fog so thick I could barely see past my hood, crawling along at 20 miles per hour with my hazards on. A motorcyclist appeared in the mirror, one of those crazy riders who thought visibility laws were suggestion. But as I watched, he multiplied into hundreds, a swarm of bikes all weaving through traffic that didn't exist, performing stunts and crashes and recoveries in an endless loop of variations. One version of him lost control, sliding under the wheels of my trailer in the mirror. I felt nothing, no impact, but in the reflection I could see him there, crushed, while another version of him continued riding past, and another pulled over to help, and another simply vanished. All these possibilities playing out simultaneously in that single piece of glass, showing me every potential outcome of every moment. That's when I began to understand what the mirror really did. It wasn't just multiplying things, it was showing different timelines, parallel versions of the same moment, all the ways reality could branch and split. Every decision, every tiny variation in speed or position, created a new reflection, and they were all equally real in that mirror's view. The question was, which one was I actually living in? I started seeing myself multiplied too. Quick glances would show 2 or 3 versions of me in the driver's seat, one checking blind spots, another reaching for coffee, a third already taking the exit I was only thinking about taking. Sometimes one version would be bleeding from an accident that hadn't happened, or hadn't happened yet, or had happened in another timeline. Once I saw myself dead, slumped over the wheel, while another me drove on obliviously, and a third me was calling. The multiplication wasn't random, it followed patterns I began to recognize. The more critical the moment, the more variations appeared. Approaching a way station would show dozens of outcomes, some where I passed through clear, others where I was pulled aside, inspected, fined, arrested. The mirror was showing me the weight of every decision, the butterfly effect made visible in silvered glass. I tried covering it, but the reflections bled through any cloth I put over it. I tried removing it, but the bolts had somehow fused, become part of the truck's frame in a way that made no sense. Even when I parked and walked away, I could feel it multiplying things behind me, creating new versions of reality that existed in that reflection whether I was watching or not. The breaking point came at a truck stop in Arkansas. I was exhausted, hadn't slept properly in days because I kept seeing different versions of myself in that mirror, some sleeping, some driving, some screaming. I stumbled into the restroom and saw my reflection in the normal mirror above the sink. Just one of me, haggard and shaking. But when I returned to the truck, the rear view showed the parking lot full of identical versions of my Peterbilt. Hundreds of them, each with a different version of me inside. Some were leaving, some had just arrived, some had been there for days. I could see myself dead in several, murdered in others. In one I was laughing with a woman I'd never met, in another I was being arrested. All these possibilities, all these versions, existing simultaneously in that cursed mirror. I watched myself walk to my truck from a dozen different angles, take a dozen different paths, make a dozen different choices. That's when I noticed one version of me wasn't heading to a truck at all. This version was walking away, leaving everything behind, disappearing into the night on. As I watched that version multiplied too, becoming dozens of escaped versions, all choosing different directions, different futures that didn't involve the mirror. And I realized that was the answer, the only timeline where the multiplication stopped. But I couldn't do it. I got in my truck, started the engine, and kept driving, because in the mirror I could also see the versions where I stayed, where I succeeded, where I made it home. The mirror showed me that every choice existed somewhere, and as long as I kept moving, kept deciding, I was all of them, and none of them simultaneously. Now I drive with 100 versions of myself, 1,000 vehicles sharing the road in that reflection. Sometimes they crash into each other, these multiplied possibilities, creating pileups that never happened but also absolutely did. Sometimes I see myself in the future, old and still driving, or young again somehow, or dead but still behind the wheel. The mirror shows it all, every thread of possibility spreading out behind me like a wake. Other drivers have started noticing something's wrong. They say they see my truck in multiple places at once, that I passed them 3 times without ever actually passing. The DOT has records of my vehicle being in different states simultaneously. My employer gets delivery confirmations for loads I haven't carried yet, or carried last week, or never carried at all. I've become unstuck in possibility, existing in multiple timelines that the mirror keeps creating and destroying. Every glance backwards splits reality a little more, until I don't know which version of me is the real one, or if there even is a real one anymore. Maybe I'm all of them, scattered across infinite reflections, driving the same roads in slightly different ways forever. The woman at the swap meet, I went back to find her, to demand answers or beg her to take it back. But she exists in multiple versions too now, some where she never sold me the mirror, some where she warned me, more strongly, some where she's been dead for decades. The swap meet itself phases in and out of existence, there in some timelines, never built in others. So I keep driving, avoiding the mirror when I can, watching the multiplication when I can't resist. Sometimes I see beautiful possibilities, versions where everything went right. Other times I see nightmares, reflections of choices that led to horror. But mostly I see the mundane multiplication of reality, every moment spawning infinite variations, all of them equally real in that silver glass. Late at night, when the multiplication gets so intense that the mirror becomes a solid sheet of light from all the reflected headlights, I wonder if maybe this is how reality always was. Maybe we're all living multiple lives simultaneously, and the mirror just makes it visible. Maybe every driver on every highway exists in infinite versions, and this cursed rear view is just showing me the truth we're not meant to see. The mirror reflects everything behind me, but multiplied into infinity, showing not just what is but what was, what might be, what could never be but somehow still exists in that silver surface. And sometimes in the corner of all those reflections, I see something else something that exists in every timeline simultaneously, feeding on the multiplication, growing stronger with each split reality, waiting for the moment when the divisions become so numerous that the barriers between possibilities collapse entirely. But I keep driving, because in at least one timeline, I have to. In at least one reflection, I make it home. In at least one version of reality, the mirror is just a mirror, and I'm just tired, and none of this multiplication is real. I just have to figure out which timeline that is, and how to get there from here, wherever and whenever here actually is anymore. I've been driving the same stretch of Highway 50 through Nevada for 12 hours now, and I haven't moved more than 50 miles according to the landscape, but my odometer says I've traveled over 700. The fuel gauge hasn't budged either, stuck at 3/4 full despite the engine running constantly. I should be panicking, but there's something hypnotic about the repetition, like being rocked to sleep by the familiar curves that keep coming back around, the same scattered Joshua trees passing by my window in the same order. Again, it started as a simple run from Sacramento to Denver, hauling automotive parts in my old International ProStar. I'd driven Highway 50 dozens of times before, knew every small town, every mountain pass, every stretch of desert where cell service disappeared. They call it the loneliest road in America, but I'd always found it peaceful, meditative even. Just you and the asphalt and the endless sky. No traffic to speak of. No complications. The first sign something was wrong came near Austin, that little mining town that feels frozen in time. I passed the same abandoned gas station 3 times in 20 minutes, each time approaching it from the exact same angle, seeing the same broken window, the same tumbleweed caught against the same rusted pump. My GPS showed me making steady eastward progress, but my eyes were telling a different story. I pulled over after the 4th pass, got out to check my tires, thinking maybe I'd gotten turned around somehow in the monotony of the desert. But the sun was exactly where it should be for late afternoon, shadows pointing the right direction, everything normal except for the fact that I kept arriving at the same spots. The road behind me looked straight, stretching back toward California. The road ahead looked straight too, heading toward Utah. But somewhere in between, something was bending. When I got back in the truck and started driving again, I paid closer attention. The road wasn't physically circular, I could see that clearly. It ran straight as an arrow through the desert, but space itself seemed to be curved, twisted into a loop that kept feeding back into itself. I'd watch a distinctive rock formation approach on my right, pass it, watch it recede in my mirrors. Then 15 minutes later, there it would be again, approaching on my right. The really unsettling part was that each loop was slightly different. Small variations that shouldn't exist on a fixed highway. A speed limit sign that read 70. The first time showed 65 the second time, then 75 the third. The mile markers counted normally for a while, then would skip numbers, or sometimes count backwards. Roadwork that hadn't been there before would appear, forcing me to slow down, then vanish on the next pass, like it had never existed. I tried taking exits, any exit, just to break the pattern, but each off-ramp led to the same thing, a short stretch of secondary road that curved back onto Highway 50, depositing me right back in the loop. Even when I turned completely around, drove west instead of east, the road somehow delivered me to the same starting point of the circle, that abandoned gas station near Austin, rising up from the heat mirages, like a ship from fog. The CB radio was no help. Other truckers' voices came through clear, talking about their own routes, complaining about weather in states I should have been reaching by now. When I tried to transmit, to tell someone I was stuck, the words that came out of my mouth weren't what I intended to say. Instead, I heard myself giving road reports, casual conversation, acting like everything was normal. The loop wouldn't let me ask for help. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, I noticed other vehicles caught in the same trap. A yellow Volkswagen van that I'd been passing and repassing for hours, its driver no longer even trying to wave. A motorcycle that would speed past, disappear into the distance, then be behind me again minutes later. We were all circling together, planets in the same orbital decay. The strangest encounter was with another semi, a white Kenworth hauling a refrigerated trailer. The driver and I made eye contact as we passed, and I could see in his expression that he'd been here longer than me. His eyes had that 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd given up fighting, who'd accepted the circle as their new reality. His beard was longer than it should be, for someone who'd just been driving for a day or two. How long had he been circling? Weeks? Months? Night fell, but the loop continued. The stars wheeled overhead in their normal patterns, while I drove the same stretch of road below, passing the same formations, the same abandoned structures, the same nothing over and over. My fuel gauge still read 3/4 full. The engine temperature stayed perfectly centered. Even my physical needs seemed suspended. No hunger, no need for bathroom breaks. Just an endless capacity to keep driving the circle. That's when I started seeing the other loops. In the darkness beyond the highway, faint lights moving in patterns that didn't match any roads on the map. Other circles, running parallel to mine, but at different elevations, different angles. Some were smaller, tighter loops that cyclists or pedestrians might be trapped in. Others were vast, maybe encompassing entire counties, taking days to complete a single circuit. We were all caught in our own personal orbits, spiraling through the desert, in endless repetition. I began mapping the variations in each loop, using my notebook to track the small changes. The abandoned gas station would sometimes have different graffiti. The Joshua trees would be in slightly different positions. Once I passed through a thunderstorm that hadn't been there the previous loop, rain hammering the windshield for exactly 3 miles before abruptly stopping. The road was bone dry on the next pass, like the storm had never happened. The worst part was when I started seeing myself, not reflections or mirages, but actual other versions of my truck, traveling the loop at different points. I'd see my own taillights ahead, watch myself passing in the opposite direction, even pulled alongside myself once, looking over to see my own face, staring back with the same shocked expression. We were layered on top of each other, multiple versions of the same journey, happening simultaneously on the same curved stretch of space. I tried everything to break free, stopping completely, just parking in the middle of the road. But time seemed to keep moving even when I didn't. The circle rotating beneath me like a giant conveyor belt, carrying me along whether I drove or not. I tried driving as fast as the truck would go, pushing it to its limits, but speed just made the loops happen faster, the same scenery flashing by in rapid repetition. I even tried jackknifing the trailer, blocking the entire road, but the loop just reformed around the obstruction, the road temporarily becoming 4 lanes, to pass my own crashed vehicle. The GPS still showed forward progress, claiming I was now somewhere in Colorado, should be approaching Denver soon. But the view outside remained steadfastly Nevada desert, the same 50-mile stretch, playing on an endless loop. The distance between what the instruments showed and what reality presented grew wider with each circuit, like 2 films playing increasingly out of sync. On what must have been my 100th pass, I noticed something new. A figure standing beside the road near the abandoned gas station, just at the edge of my headlight range. It looked human at first, a hitchhiker maybe, but as I got closer I realized it was too tall, too thin, its proportions all wrong. It didn't move as I passed, just stood there watching, and in my mirrors I could see it turn to follow my progress, its head rotating farther than any neck should allow. The figure was there on every loop after that, never in exactly the same spot but always somewhere along the circuit, sometimes closer to the road, sometimes farther away, but always watching, always noting my passage like it was counting the loops, keeping track of how many times I'd circled. On one pass there were 2 of them, then they were multiplying, or more were arriving, gathering to observe the trapped vehicles like scientists studying mice in a maze. I found a partial solution by accident. While fiddling with the radio, I discovered that certain frequencies seemed to weaken the loop. Static at specific wavelengths would cause the road to flicker, showing glimpses of what should be there, the actual Highway 50 continuing east toward Utah. But the moment I changed the frequency or turned the radio off, the loop reasserted itself, snapping back like a rubber band. So now I'm driving with white noise blasting, trying to find the exact frequency that will break the circle completely. The other trapped vehicles have noticed. I can see them attempting the same thing, their radios adding to the cacophony. We're creating a wall of static that makes the loop unstable, causes it to wobble and distort. The tall figures don't like it. They've moved closer, and there are dozens of them now, surrounding the circuit like guards. The dashboard clock has become meaningless, showing times that don't correspond to the sun's position. My phone thinks it's been 3 days since I left Sacramento, but my beard growth suggests it's been weeks. The other driver, the one in the white Kenworth, his beard reaches his chest now. How long before we become like those figures beside the road, transformed by the endless repetition into something that isn't quite human anymore? But there's something else I've noticed, a pattern in the loops that might be a way out. Every 7th circuit, at exactly the moment I pass mile marker 2087, there's a split second where the road ahead shows 2 possibilities. One continues the loop, but the other, barely visible, shows a different road entirely, one that leads off at an angle that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. I've been trying to time it right, to wrench the wheel at exactly that moment and take the impossible exit. The tall figures seem to know what I'm attempting. They've started moving onto the road itself during that crucial moment, trying to block the hidden exit, but I'm going to try again on the next path. The static is building, the loop is weakening, and I can feel something beyond this circle calling to me. It might be escape, or it might be just another kind of trap. A bigger loop that contains this one. The fuel gauge still reads 3/4 full. The engine still runs perfectly. I could theoretically keep driving this circle forever, becoming a permanent feature of the route, like those abandoned buildings I keep passing. Maybe that's what those structures really are, the remains of other travelers who gave up, who accepted the circle and slowly transformed into landmarks for the next wave of trap drivers to pass endlessly. But I'm not ready to become part of the scenery yet. The next loop is coming up, mile marker 2087 approaching fast. The figures are gathering at that spot, their impossible tall forms creating a forest of watchers. The hidden exit will only be visible for a fraction of a second, but I'll be ready this time. The static is screaming, reality is bending, and somewhere beyond this eternal circle, the real Highway 50 continues on toward Denver, toward delivery, toward a world where roads actually lead somewhere, instead of folding back on themselves. I can see the mile marker coming up now. The figures are stepping onto the asphalt, trying to block my path. The other trapped vehicles are following my lead, all of us aiming for the same impossible exit. Maybe we'll make it, maybe we won't, but at least we're trying to break free from this route that draws circle, this road that goes everywhere and nowhere, this loop that might be all that's left of Highway 50, or might be something else entirely, something that was always here, waiting for drivers to stumble into its perfect endless circulation. The exit is there, flickering like a mirage. I'm turning the wheel now, hoping this reaches someone, anyone, who might find themselves on Highway 50 through Nevada. If you see an abandoned gas station near Austin more than once, if the mile markers stop making sense, if you notice your fuel gauge isn't dropping, don't ignore it. Turn around while you still can, before the circle completes itself, before you become another vehicle in the endless rotation, another driver learning that some routes don't lead anywhere except back to where they started, over and over, forever. I should have known better than to take Highway 101 through the Oregon coast that October night, especially when the marine forecast was calling for heavy fog. But I had a load of fresh seafood that needed to reach San Francisco by morning, and the company was paying triple rate for the overnight haul. 28 years of driving, and I thought I'd seen every kind of weather the Pacific could throw at me. I hadn't seen anything yet. The fog started normally enough near Florence, those gentle wisps that drift across the headlights like silk scarves. I'd driven through coastal fog hundreds of times, knew to slow down, watch for the reflective markers, trust my instruments more than my eye. My Mac Anthem had good fog lights, and I'd just had the defrosters serviced. I was prepared for the usual, that thick white blanket that turns the world into a snow globe of mist and shadow. But this fog was different from the start. It had a gray-green tinge to it, like the color of deep ocean water, and it moved with purpose rather than drifting. It would surge toward the truck in waves, breaking against the windshield like surf, then pull back as if gathering strength for another assault. The droplets it left behind on the glass weren't clear like water, but slightly cloudy, with an oily rainbow sheen that made the wipers streak. The first breach happened near Reedsport. I had the windows rolled up tight, the climate control on recirculate, but somehow a tendril of fog found its way inside. It seeped through the door seal like smoke, a thin gray finger that explored the cab with what seemed like curiosity. I watched it from the corner of my eye, not wanting to take my attention off the increasingly obscured road, as it probed along the dashboard, wrapped around the steering column, touched the roofliner with wispy finger. The temperature dropped immediately, my breath suddenly visible, despite the heater running full blast. The fog inside didn't dissipate like it should have in the warm air. Instead it gathered substance, thickening into a presence that occupied the passenger seat like it had bought a ticket. I could feel it watching me, though it had no eyes, examining me with the kind of intelligence that fog should not possess. I tried to wave it away with my hand, but my fingers passed through nothing but cold moisture that left my skin tingling and numb. The fog seemed amused by my attempt, swirling into patterns that might have been laughter if vapor could express emotion. It settled back into the passenger seat, maintaining a roughly human shape, though the edges constantly shifted and reformed like it couldn't quite remember what people were supposed to look like. The road was getting harder to see, the external fog growing thicker with each mile. My fog lights barely penetrated 3 feet ahead, and the white line on the road's edge became my only guide. But the fog inside the cab was the real problem. It was spreading, exploring every corner of the truck, seeping into the sleeper berth, investigating my belongings with invasive curiosity. I could hear it rustling through my papers, opening and closing cabinet doors, testing the equipment with touches that left everything damp and cold. Then it started affecting the electronics. The radio cycled through stations on its own, each one playing nothing but static that sounded like whispered conversations in a language that predated words. The GPS screen flickered, showing my location as places that didn't exist, coordinates that put me miles out to sea or deep underground. The speedometer spun wildly, though I was barely crawling along at 15 miles per hour. The fog in the passenger seat began to solidify further, taking on more definition. I could make out suggestions of features, a profile that would form for a moment then dissolve, eyes that would hold their shape just long enough for me to realize they were looking at me. It was trying to become something, to manifest into a form that could interact more directly with the physical world, using the moisture it had brought inside as raw material. That's when I noticed my own breath wasn't producing normal vapor anymore. When I exhaled, the fog would lean toward me, drawing in my breath like it was feeding on it. Each exhalation made it slightly more solid, slightly more real. I tried holding my breath, but that only made the next exhale stronger, and the fog grew excited, surging toward my face to capture every molecule of warm air from my lungs. The windows were completely fogged now, not from normal condensation but from the entity spreading itself across every surface. I couldn't see the mirrors, couldn't see anything outside except the faint glow of my own headlights reflected back from the wall of fog surrounding the truck. I was driving blind, trusting to luck in the hope that the road remained empty. The rumble strips on the shoulder became my only navigation, that rhythmic vibration letting me know when I was drifting too far right. The fog started speaking, or something like speak. It was more like thoughts appearing in my head that weren't my own, concepts and images that the fog was pushing into my consciousness. It showed me the ocean depths, places where sunlight never reached, where the pressure would crush any normal creature, where things lived that had no names because no human had ever seen them, and survived. It showed me that's where it came from, pulled up from those depths by temperature changes, pressure differentials, forces that should have kept it contained but hadn't. It was hungry, that much was clear. Not for food in any conventional sense, but for something that living things carried, some essential warmth or energy that it could only access here, above the water, inside the confined space of my cab. Every breath I took, every beat of my heart, was feeding it, making it stronger, more capable of maintaining its form in this alien environment of air and metal. I tried opening the windows to let it out, but the fog outside pressed against the glass like a solid wall, preventing the inside fog from leaving even as more of it seeped in through gaps I couldn't see. The cab was becoming a pressure vessel, filled with so much fog that it was getting hard to breathe. The air was thick, wet, like trying to inhale soup. My lungs burned with the effort of extracting oxygen from the supernatural moisture. The seafood in my trailer was reacting to the fog's presence. I could hear it back there, the sound carrying through the walls, thousands of pounds of dead fish moving, flopping against the refrigerated walls like they were trying to escape, or maybe trying to get closer to whatever the fog was. The refrigeration unit was screaming, working overtime to maintain temperature as the fog somehow made everything colder than ice, while keeping it wet. I passed through what I thought was Coos Bay, though I couldn't see any lights or signs to confirm it. The fog entity had nearly filled the cab now, and I was breathing more water than air. It had given up trying to maintain a human shape, instead surrounding me completely, pressing against my skin with a cold that went deeper than temperature, a cold that seemed to leach the very concept of warmth from my bones. Then something changed. The fog suddenly contracted, pulling away from me like it had sensed something dangerous. Through the briefly clear windshield, I saw lights ahead, Not normal headlights, but a brilliant blue-white glow that cut through the external fog like it wasn't there. A vehicle was approaching, something official by the light pattern, maybe Coast Guard or some specialized emergency service I'd never encountered. The fog in my cab became agitated, swirling faster, trying to hide itself or maybe preparing to defend against whatever was coming. The approaching lights grew brighter, and I heard a sound like sonar pinging, a rhythmic pulse that made the fog entity writhe and contract with each beat. The entity pushed more thoughts at me, urgent now, panicked even. It showed me images of being dragged back down, imprisoned in crushing darkness, contained by barriers it couldn't cross again. The vehicle pulled alongside me, and through my driver's side window, I saw it wasn't any kind of truck I recognized. It was shaped wrong, built from materials that didn't reflect light properly, equipped with instruments that hurt to look at directly. The driver was wearing what looked like a hazmat suit, but modified with equipment I couldn't identify, tubes and wires running from a tank on their back to a helmet that completely obscured their face. They held up a sign, professionally printed but with text that seemed to shift and rearrange itself as I watched. The only words that remained stable were "pull over" and "containment protocol." I didn't need to be told twice. I found the next wide spot on the shoulder and stopped, setting my brakes with shaking hands while the fog entity thrashed around the cab like a trapped animal. What happened next was efficiently terrifying. Multiple vehicles surrounded my truck, all with those same brilliant lights that the fog seemed to fear. Figures in those modified hazmat suits approached with equipment that looked like weaponized dehumidifiers, devices that pulled the fog out of my cab not gently but violently, tearing it away in chunks while it fought to stay attached to my warmth, my life, whatever it had been feeding on. The extraction took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. The fog entity's final thoughts as it was pulled away were a mixture of rage and desperation, promises that it would remember me, that it would find me again when the conditions were right, when the deep currents brought it back to the surface. Then it was gone, sucked into containment vessels that sealed with locks that looked more like mystical symbols than mechanical devices. One of the suited figures climbed into my cab, scanning everything with instruments that clicked and hummed. They never spoke, just handed me a business card that was blank except for a phone number and the words "for future incidents, call immediately." Then they left, their vehicles disappearing back into the fog that now seemed utterly normal, just regular coastal moisture that stayed outside where it belonged. The rest of the drive to San Francisco was uneventful, though I kept the windows cracked despite the cold, needing to feel air movement, needing to know nothing was building up in the cab. The seafood was somehow still fresh when I delivered it, though the buyer commented that it smelled strongly of deep ocean, deeper than where it had been caught. I've kept that business card, though I've never called the number. Sometimes I wonder what would answer, what organization monitors the coast for things that shouldn't exist above sea level. I've changed my routes, avoiding the Oregon coast entirely, sticking to inland highways even if it means longer drives and less pay. But on foggy nights, wherever I am, I feel something watching from inside the mist, something that remembers the warmth of my breath, the beat of my heart, the perfect containment of my The Weather Service still issues fog advisories for Highway 101, but if you know what to look for, you can spot the special warnings hidden in the marine forecast. Phrases like unusual density variations or anomalous temperature gradients that mean something more than normal fog is forming. Those nights, the smart drivers stay off the coast entirely, leaving the roads to the containment vehicles and whatever they're hunting in the gray-green mist that rises from places too deep to have name. I still drive, still haul freight up and down the west coast, but I've installed extra seals on all my doors and windows, military-grade stuff that's designed to keep out more than just water. I keep the cab warm and dry, run a dehumidifier constantly, and never ever leave the windows open when fog is present, because I know now that some fog isn't just weather, it's something else, something that enters the cab not by accident but with intent, looking for warmth to steal, breath to consume, life to study and sample before being dragged back to the depths where it belonged. The company never asked why I refused coastal runs after that night. Maybe because they knew, maybe because I wasn't the first driver to encounter something in the fog that shouldn't exist. The seafood industry has its own unspoken rules about what happens when the ocean sends something unusual to the surface. We deliver it. We don't talk about it. And we hope the containment teams are watching, ready to extract anything that tries to hitch a ride in our cab, feeding on our warmth while showing us visions of places where the pressure would crush us into nothing, and things without names wait in the darkness for their chance to rise. I've crossed the Millfield Bridge outside Beckley, West Virginia, probably 300 times in my career, and it was always just another span over another gorge in coal country. Built in 1952, steel truss design, 2 lanes, nothing special except for how deep the valley dropped beneath it. But last Thursday, making a late-night run with a load of mining equipment, I discovered why the locals only cross it when they absolutely have to, and never ever when it's empty. It was past 2 in the morning when I approached the bridge, that dead time when even the CB radio goes quiet and you're alone with the engine noise in your thoughts. My Freightliner Cascadia was the only vehicle I'd seen for miles. The mountain roads empty except for the occasional deer eyes glowing in the darkness. The bridge appeared in my headlights like it always did, a skeleton of green-painted steel stretching across the void. I slowed down as I always do for these old bridges, checking my mirrors to make sure the load was stable. That's when I noticed something that made my foot ease off the accelerator entirely. The bridge was moving, but not from wind or structural set. It was expanding and contracting rhythmically, the steel beams flexing in and out like ribs, the road surface rising and falling maybe an inch or 2, just enough to notice in the headlight beam. The movement had a pattern to it, slow and deep, about 4 or 5 cycles per minute. It looked exactly like breathing, like the chest of something massive, asleep, and I was about to drive across its body. I stopped at the bridge entrance, hazards clicking in the darkness, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The expansion joints were hissing softly with each cycle, air being pushed through gaps in the metal, creating a sound that was almost like a whisper, if whispers could be 50 feet wide. I grabbed my spotlight and swept it across the structure. The bridge looked normal enough in the harsh white light, just old steel and newer concrete patches, cables and rivets and rust stains. But the breathing continued, undeniable, the entire span gently rising and falling in that sleeping rhythm. Each exhale sent a breeze across my truck that smelled like deep earth and coal dust and something else, something organic and ancient. My first thought was to turn around, find another route, but the next bridge was 40 miles out of my way, and I was already pushing my delivery window. Besides, vehicles had been crossing this bridge for 70 years. Whatever was happening, it couldn't be immediately dangerous, or there would be warnings, signs, something. So I put the truck in gear and started forward, feeling the road surface rise beneath my wheels as the bridge took another breath. The moment my front tires touched the bridge deck, the breathing changed. It hitched, like when you disturb someone in deep sleep, and they almost wake up. The rhythm became irregular, sometimes holding its breath for long seconds, then releasing in quick, shallow pants. I could feel it through the steering wheel, through the seat, a living pulse that turned the bridge into something more than steel and concrete. Halfway across, the bridge held its breath completely. Everything went still, that kind of stillness that makes your ears ring with its intensity. My engine seemed quieter, the tire noise muffled, even the wind stopped. I was suspended over the gorge on lungs that weren't breathing, waiting for something to happen. My speedometer showed 15 miles per hour, but it felt like I wasn't moving at all, like the bridge was holding me in place. Then it exhaled, one long deep breath that lasted maybe 20 seconds. The sound was tremendous, not loud exactly, but big, coming from everywhere at once. The steel beams groaned and sang, harmonizing in frequencies that made my teeth ache. The road surface rippled beneath my truck, and for a moment, I swear I could see through it, see down into something that wasn't the gorge below, but somewhere else, somewhere that had no business existing beneath a bridge in West Virginia. Through that momentary transparency, I glimpsed things that bridges dream about. Every crossing ever made, every vehicle, every footstep, layered on top of each other like double exposure. I saw coal trucks from the 50s, horse-drawn wagons that predated the bridge itself, future vehicles that hadn't been built yet, all crossing simultaneously in a parade of ghost traffic that the bridge remembered or anticipated or imagined. The exhalation ended, and the bridge went back to its normal breathing, though faster now, excited maybe, or disturbed. I kept driving, fighting the urge to floor it, knowing that panic would only make things worse. The bridge deck felt soft under my tires, yielding slightly with each breath, like driving on flesh instead of concrete. My full load of mining equipment, all 40 tons of it, seemed to weigh nothing, the bridge holding us up with effort that had nothing to do with engineering. 3/4 of the way across, I encountered the others. They were standing along the sides of the bridge, translucent figures that became visible only when the bridge exhaled. Workers in old construction gear, their faces obscured by shadows that didn't match the lighting. They watched my truck pass, with the patient attention of people who had nowhere else to be, who had been standing there since the bridge was built, maybe longer. One of them stepped into my lane, not threateningly, just observed. I should have swerved or stopped, but somehow I knew he wasn't really there, not in any way that could cause a collision. My truck passed through him, and for an instant, I felt what he felt, the weight of every vehicle that had ever crossed, the accumulated fatigue of 70 years of traffic, the deep, bone-deep tiredness that made the bridge need to breathe, to rest, to process the constant burden of connection. The radio crackled to life with voices that weren't on any channel. Conversations from decades past. Truckers talking about loads of coal, about families, about roads that had been rerouted long ago. They were talking about the bridge too, warning each other about crossing it empty, though none of them could quite explain why. Just that empty was bad. Empty meant the bridge noticed you, remembered you, might keep you. I looked in my mirrors and saw my own truck reflected infinitely, crossing the bridge over and over in a line that stretched back through time. Some versions were newer, some older, some were trucks I'd never owned but might have in different circumstances. All of them were crossing at this exact moment, whenever this moment was, because the bridge existed at all moments simultaneously when it breathed. The end of the bridge was approaching, but it seemed to stretch, adding extra spans that hadn't been there before. The breathing grew deeper, more deliberate, like it was trying to keep me there, to add me to its collection of crossings. I could feel it pulling at the truck, not physically but temporally, trying to lock this moment in place, to make my crossing eternal, like those phantom workers. I pressed harder on the accelerator, not speeding but insisting on forward motion. The engine strained against resistance that had nothing to do with grade or wind. The bridge exhaled again, longer this time, and in that breath, I heard voices, hundreds of them, all the drivers who had become part of the bridge's breathing cycle. Some were warning me to leave, others inviting me to stay, to rest, to stop carrying loads and become part of the load that the bridge carried. The mining equipment in my trailer started shifting, not from momentum but from the bridge's breathing, affecting its molecular structure. I could hear metal groaning, reforming, becoming something between solid and gas, something that existed in the spaces between breaths. The bridge was trying to digest us, to break us down into memory and incorporate us into its dreams. With maybe 50 feet to go, the bridge stopped breathing entirely. The sudden stillness was worse than the movement, like the moment before a scream. I could feel it gathering itself, preparing for something, maybe one final breath that would either expel me or swallow me completely. The phantom workers all turned to watch, their shadow faces focused on my truck with an intensity that made the air itself feel heavy. I did the only thing I could think of. I laid on the horn, 3 long blasts that echoed through the steel structure and down into the gorge. The sound was shocking in the stillness, a declaration that I was here, I was real, I was not ready to become part of the bridge's respiratory system. The horn seemed to surprise it, interrupt whatever it had been preparing. The bridge gasped, a quick intake of breath that created a vacuum that pulled at my truck. Then it released me, the road suddenly solid and normal beneath my tire. The last 20 feet passed in an instant, my truck practically thrown onto solid ground by a final dismissive exhalation. I felt the bridge's attention leave me, turn inward, go back to its deep, dreaming breath. I pulled over a quarter-mile past the bridge, hands shaking too hard to drive safely. In my mirrors I could see it continuing its breathing cycle, peaceful now, rhythmic, like nothing had happened. But I could also see something else. Other vehicles approaching it were slowing down, some turning around entirely, their drivers sensing what I now knew for certain. The Millfield Bridge was alive in some way, conscious in others, and hungry always. I made my delivery on time, didn't mention what had happened to anyone at the depot. But I've been researching since then, finding old newspaper archives, construction records, stories that people only tell after a few drinks. The bridge was built on a site that was sacred to the indigenous peoples, a place where they said the earth itself breathed. The coal mine that the gorge leads to had a collapse in 1951, trapping 37 miners. They were never recovered. The shaft was sealed, and the bridge was built the next year, directly over the sealed entrance. Now I take the long way around, those extra 40 miles that keep me off the Millfield Bridge. But sometimes on quiet nights, I can still feel it breathing in the distance, that rhythm carrying through the mountains like a heart. Other drivers have started reporting similar experiences, bridges and overpasses that seem to respirate when empty, that hold their breath when crossed, that dream of the traffic they carry. There's a theory among the old-timers that all bridges do this, that the act of spanning impossible spaces gives them a kind of life, a need to process the constant violation of gravity and distance. Most bridges breathe so slowly, we never notice. Maybe one breath per year, per decade. But some, like Millfield, breathe fast enough to perceive, fast enough to interact with, fast enough to hunger for the living warmth of the vehicles that cross them. I've marked all the breathing bridges on my map now, the ones that truckers whisper about at rest stops. The Millfield Bridge, the Crescent Overpass in Montana, the Old Saint Bridge in Louisiana, dozens of others, scattered across the country. They're all different ages, different designs, but they all have one thing in common. They were built where something was buried, sealed or forgotten. They breathe because they're trying to exhale something that shouldn't be contained, or maybe they're trying to inhale something that shouldn't be. Late at night when I'm crossing normal, non-breathing bridges, I sometimes wonder if they're just holding their breath while I pass, waiting until they're empty to resume their ancient rhythm. I wonder if every piece of infrastructure we've built has this secret life, this need to respirate, this hunger for the vehicles that give them purpose. And I wonder what happens when a bridge stops breathing entirely, whether that means it's died, or just achieved some state beyond the need for breath. The Millfield Bridge still breathes. Drivers report it regularly now. But its rhythm has changed since my crossing, become more irregular, more agitated. Sometimes it hyperventilates. Sometimes it holds its breath for hours. The locals say it's looking for something, or they say it remembers every vehicle that ever crossed it, and it notices when one stops coming. They say it's waiting for me to return, to complete whatever transaction we started that night. But I won't go back. I'll take the long routes, the extra miles, the delayed delivery, because I know that if I cross that bridge again, especially when it's empty, especially when it's breathing deep and slow in its dreams, I might not make it to the other side, or worse, I might make it across but leave something behind, some essential part of myself that would become part of the bridge's breathing, part of its dreams, part of the endless cycle of inhalation and exhalation that keeps it alive and hungry and waiting in the darkness of the West Virginia mountains. The Devil's Load, from Carol Vaughn. I picked up the trailer from a depot in Laredo that I'd never used before, one of those overflow lots that companies contract when their main facilities are full. The paperwork said it was a standard 53-foot dry van, recently refurbished, assigned to me for a textile run to Chicago. But standing there in the noon Texas sun, Something about it made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way heat shimmer rose off its aluminum sides differently than the other trailers, or how the shadows beneath it seemed too dark for midday. The previous driver had left a note tucked into the door seal, just 2 words scrawled on a receipt. Don't look. No explanation, no signature, just that warning that I stupidly dismissed as some rookie's prank. I did my pre-trip inspection like always, checking the tires, the brake lines, the door seals. Everything was normal, pristine even, like the trailer had just rolled off the factory floor. The VIN number was legitimate, the DOT numbers current, nothing to suggest this trailer was anything other than what it claimed to be. I backed my Kenworth T680 under it, felt the 5th wheel lock into place with that familiar solid thunk, and started north toward Chicago. The first few hours were uneventful, just the usual Texas highway stretching endlessly ahead, the trailer riding smooth and stable behind me. The weight was right for a load of textiles, about 32,000 pounds according to the bills, and it pulled like any other box I'd hauled 1,000 times before. The first horn appeared somewhere near Austin, though I didn't notice it immediately. It was during a fuel stop that I walked back to check the trailer and saw it, a small protrusion on the left side, about 6 feet from the front, maybe 3 inches long. It looked like a tent spike pushing out from the inside, stretching the aluminum skin without breaking it. I touched it, found it solid and warm, warmer than the metal around it despite being in shade. It felt organic somehow, like touching a tooth through cloth. I figured the load had shifted, maybe a broken pallet allowing something to press against the wall. It happens, especially with textile rolls that can slip if they're not secured properly. I made a note to have it checked at the next weigh station, but didn't think much more about it. Chicago was still 1,800 miles away, and I had a schedule to keep. By the time I reached Dallas, there were 4 of them, 2 on each side, positioned almost symmetrically, each one longer than the first. They were definitely horns now, not just protrusions, but actual horn-shaped growths pushing out from within. The aluminum skin stretched around them like latex, thinning to show the texture beneath, which looked disturbingly like bone or keratin. Other drivers were starting to notice, pointing as they passed, some taking pictures with their phone. I pulled into a rest area and tried to open the trailer doors to see what was happening inside, but they wouldn't budge. The lock was still in place, unbroken, but it was like the doors had been welded shut from the inside. I could hear movement in there, a sliding, scraping sound, like something massive repositioning itself. The textile load shouldn't have been making any noise at all, certainly not sounds that suggested consciousness and intent. The horns continued growing as I drove through Oklahoma. By the time I reached the state line, they were over a foot long, curved like ram's horns, and multiplying. A row of smaller ones had appeared along the roofline, pushing up through the metal like fins. The trailer's profile in my mirrors was becoming increasingly wrong, transforming from a rectangular box into something that looked more like a living creature, some massive thing that was using the trailer as a chrysalis. The weight was changing too. My fuel consumption was increasing, but when I crossed a weigh station, the scales showed I was actually getting lighter. Whatever was growing those horns was consuming the original cargo, converting textile mass into something else. The DOT officer at the station took one look at my trailer and waved me through without inspection, his face pale, his hand moving to his radio the moment I passed. Night fell as I entered Kansas, and that's when the horns began to glow. Not brightly, just a dull red luminescence like coals in a dying fire. In my mirrors I could see them pulsing slightly, synchronized with something that might have been a heartbeat if trailers had heart. Other traffic was giving me a wide berth now, nobody wanting to pass. Everyone content to follow at a safe distance, or take alternate routes entirely. The CB radio was going crazy with chatter about me. Drivers asking what the hell I was hauling, warning each other about the devil truck heading north on I-35. Some were saying prayers over the airwaves, others sharing stories about cursed loads they'd heard about but never believed. One old-timer said he'd seen something similar back in the 80s, a trailer that had grown horns while carrying cargo from a demolished church in Louisiana. That driver had disappeared, he said, trailer and all, somewhere in Missouri. I tried calling dispatch, but my phone had no signal despite being in the middle of coverage area. The GPS was working, but it kept trying to route me off the interstate, downstate highways and farm roads that led to places with names like Devil's Hollow and Perdition Creek. I stuck to I-35, figuring staying on main roads with plenty of witnesses was my best bet for surviving whatever was happening. By midnight, the transformation was accelerating. The horns were now massive, some over 3 feet long, twisted into impossible spirals that hurt to look at directly. They'd burst through the aluminum skin entirely in places, revealing glimpses of something dark and wet beneath. The trailer was reshaping itself, the rectangular form warping into something more organic, more intentional. The wheels still turned, the brake lights still worked, but everything else was becoming unrecognizable. I could feel it pulling at me too, not physically, but mentally. Whispers in a language that predated speech, promises of power and transformation, if I just stopped fighting, if I just accepted what was happening. The steering wheel was getting harder to control, not because of mechanical failure, but because something was trying to drive us somewhere specific. Some destination that wasn't Chicago, wasn't on any map I'd ever seen. The breaking point came at a rest area near Wichita. I'd stopped to splash water on my face, to clear my head, to figure out what to do. When I returned to the truck, the trailer had changed again. The horns had arranged themselves into a pattern, a symbol that hurt to perceive, that seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3. Looking at it made my nose bleed, made my thoughts scatter like frightened birds. But worse was what I saw inside through a gap, where the metal had torn. The textile cargo was gone, replaced by something that pulsed and writhed, something with too many eyes and not enough skin, something that was using the trailer as a womb to gestate into our world. It saw me looking and pressed against the gap, an eye the size of a dinner plate, focusing on me with intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. I ran back to the cab, started the engine, and did something I'd never done in 30 years of driving. I deliberately jackknifed the rig. I cranked the wheel hard at 40 miles per hour, felt the trailer swing wide, the fifth wheel groaning under the stress. The trailer tipped, tilted, and would have rolled if those horns hadn't suddenly extended, digging into the asphalt like claws, keeping it upright through physics that shouldn't exist. That's when I realized the horns weren't just growing randomly. They were functional, turning the trailer into something that could move on its own, that didn't need my truck to pull it. I hit the fifth wheel release, heard it disengage, and floored it. In my mirrors I watched the trailer stand there on the highway, supported by dozens of horns that had become legs, that symbol on its side glowing like a doorway to somewhere else. It started following me, moving with a lurching gait that covered ground faster than it should. The horns clicked against the asphalt like hooves, like claws, like something between the two. Cars swerved to avoid it, some ending up in ditches, others just stopping dead in the middle of the road, their drivers unable to process what they were seeing. I pushed the Kenworth to its limits, engine screaming, temperature gauges redlining. Behind me the thing that had been my trailer was gaining, its transformed shape becoming more confident in its movement, more coordinated. The horns were still growing, some now dragging on the ground, leaving gouges in the asphalt that glowed with that same red light. It was a highway patrol roadblock that saved me. They'd set up just north of Wichita, probably responding to the dozens of emergency calls about a runaway trailer with horns. The officers opened fire the moment they saw what was chasing me, their bullets doing nothing but making it angry. But the distraction was enough. The trailer thing veered off the highway, crashing through the barrier and disappearing into a field of winter wheat. I kept driving, didn't stop until I reached Chicago, where I found out the textile company I was supposed to deliver to didn't exist. The address was real, but it had been an empty lot for 20 years. The phone numbers were disconnected. The paperwork, when examined closely, showed dates that didn't match, signatures that changed depending on the angle you looked at them, a DOT number that, when traced, belonged to a company that had gone out of business. The depot in Laredo claimed they'd never heard of me, had no record of any trailer matching that description. The security footage from that day showed me backing under what appeared to be empty air, driving away pulling nothing. But other drivers saw it, recorded it, posted videos that went viral before being mysteriously deleted. The Highway Patrol in Kansas has a report they won't release. Body cam footage they claim was corrupted. I still drive, but I'm more careful now about what trailers I accept, what loads I carry. I research every company, verify every pickup location, check the history of every piece of equipment. Because I know that trailer is still out there somewhere, still growing those horns, still transforming into whatever it was becoming. Other drivers report seeing it sometimes, always at night, always in remote areas, moving on its own through fields and forests, leaving those glowing tracks behind. There's a theory among some of the old-timers that certain cargo attracts certain trailers, that loads with dark histories call to equipment with its own darkness. They say some trailers aren't really trailers at all, but shells for things that need to be transported across thresholds, things that use our highway system as a network to spread across the country. The horns, they say, are just the beginning of the transformation, the first sign that something is gestating, preparing to emerge. I've never picked up from that depot in Laredo again, though I've driven past where it should be. There's nothing there now but desert and a chain-link fence around nothing. But sometimes in my mirrors on empty highways, I see horns in the distance, following the same routes, growing from trailers pulled by drivers who didn't check their paperwork carefully enough, who didn't notice the signs until it was too late. The note that previous driver left makes sense now. Don't look, because once you see the horns starting to grow, once you acknowledge what's happening, you become part of it. The transformation accelerates, feeds on your awareness, uses your fear as fuel. The only hope is to drop the trailer before you notice, before you become complicit in whatever dark birth is taking place in that metal womb. But I did look, and now I can't stop looking. Every trailer I see, I check for horns. Every rest area, I walk the lots looking for signs of transformation. Because I know it's not over. That thing I was hauling isn't done becoming whatever it's becoming. And sometimes late at night on empty highways, I can still feel it calling to me through the fifth wheel connection that isn't there anymore, inviting me to come back, to finish the delivery, to complete the ritual that would bring it fully into our world. The horns were just the beginning. God help us when the rest of it emerges. The echo that answers back. The diesel engine's steady rumble becomes your heartbeat. The hiss of air breaks your breathing, and the whistle of wind through your mirrors your constant companion. So when something new enters that familiar symphony, you notice it right away. That's how I first heard the siren, that shouldn't have been there, echoing across the Montana plains on a clear October night when the stars hung like scattered diamonds against the endless black. I was hauling a load of farm equipment from Billings to Great Falls, taking Highway 87 north through the kind of emptiness that city folks can't quite comprehend. Out here, the darkness swallows everything beyond your headlight beams, and the road stretches ahead like a pale ribbon threading through an ocean of nothing. My Peterbilt 379 was running smooth, her Detroit diesel purring contentedly as we climbed the gentle rises and descended into the valleys that rolled across this part of Big Sky country. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other night haulers, their voices fading in and out like ghosts on the airwaves. It was just past midnight when I first heard it, a thin wailing sound that seemed to drift in from somewhere far off to the west. At first I figured it was just the wind playing tricks, maybe singing through some rock formation or abandoned structure. The plains out here are littered with old homesteads and forgotten grain elevators, their weathered bones standing as monuments to dreams that dried up and blew away decades ago. But as I drove on, the sound grew clearer, more distinct. It was definitely a siren, the kind you might hear from an ambulance or fire truck, its urgent cry rising and falling in that familiar pattern that makes your pulse quicken even when you know it's not meant for you. I glanced at my mirrors, expecting to see emergency lights painting the darkness behind me in reds and blues. But the road remained empty. The siren continued, seeming to pace me as I drove, neither getting closer nor fading away. I rolled down my window and listened more carefully. The sound was coming from my left, somewhere out in the vast expanse of grassland that stretched to the horizon. But that didn't make sense. There were no roads out there, just cattle trails and the occasional ranch access road that led to nowhere most people cared to go. The CB crackled and I grabbed the handset. Breaker 19. This is Big Sky Marcus, heading north on 87. Any of you drivers hearing that siren out here? I waited, listening to the static, but no one answered. The airwaves were quiet except for the faint hiss of distant signals bouncing off the atmosphere. I tried again, calling out to any drivers who might be in range, but the radio gave me nothing but empty air and the whisper of cosmic background noise. The siren kept going, maintaining its steady rhythm as I drove through the small town of Grass Range, its few streetlights casting pale pools of yellow light on empty streets. Even here, with buildings around me and signs of human habitation, I could still hear it clearly. A dog barked somewhere in the darkness, perhaps stirred by the same sound that had caught my attention. But as I passed through town and back into the open country, I realized something that made my skin crawl. The siren wasn't just pacing me, it was responding to me. When I slowed for a curve, the pitch of the wail seemed to drop slightly. When I accelerated on a straightaway, it climbed higher. When I tested this theory by tapping my brakes, the siren's rhythm stuttered for just a moment before resuming its endless cry. This wasn't some distant emergency vehicle or civil defense system being tested in the middle of the night. This was something else entirely, something that was aware of my presence and reacting to my movements along this lonely stretch of highway. I reached for the CB again, my hand trembling slightly as I keyed the mic. Mayday, Mayday. This is Big Sky Marcus, on Highway 87 north of Grass Range. I've got some kind of situation out here. Anyone copy? The silence that came back was so complete it seemed to pulse with its own kind of presence. Even the usual distant chatter had vanished, as if every driver within 100 miles had simply disappeared from the airway. The only sounds were my engine, the whisper of tires on asphalt, my own breathing, and that impossible siren that continued its haunting song somewhere out in the darkness. I began to notice other things then, details that my subconscious had been registering, but my rational mind had been dismissing. The usual night sounds were gone. No insects chirping, no owls calling, no cattle lowing from the ranches scattered across the landscape. The wind had died to nothing, leaving the grass standing perfectly still under the starlight. Even my truck seemed to be running somehow differently, the familiar vibrations and sounds subtly altered in ways I couldn't quite identify. It was as if the world itself had shifted into a different key, one that my ears could detect but my mind couldn't process. The siren began to change, its tone becoming richer, more complex. What had started as a simple rising and falling wail now carried harmonics and overtones that no mechanical device could produce. It sounded almost like singing, like a voice calling out across the vast emptiness with words I couldn't quite make out, but somehow understood. The meaning came through not in language but in pure emotion. Loneliness, so profound it made my chest ache, a yearning that stretched across centuries, and underneath it all, a hunger that made every instinct I possessed scream at me to run. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the truck up to 75, then 80 miles per hour. The siren kept pace effortlessly, its volume never wavering, its position relative to my truck never changing. But now I could see something in my peripheral vision, a faint glow moving through the darkness, parallel to the highway. It wasn't quite light in any conventional sense, more like a disturbance in the air itself, a shimmer that bent the starlight in ways that hurt to look at directly. When I tried to focus on it, it vanished, but the moment I looked away, it reappeared at the edge of my vision, keeping perfect pace with my truck as we raced through the night. The highway began to climb toward the Little Belt Mountains, and I found myself grateful for the curves and rises that broke up the monotonous straightaway. But the siren followed me up every grade and around every bend, never fading, never faltering. Worse, I was beginning to hear voices within its call, not words exactly, but something that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to parts of my mind I didn't know existed. The voices were pleading, cajoling, promising things I couldn't name but desperately wanted. They whispered of rest after years of driving endless highways, of companionship after decades of solitary nights, of answers to questions I'd never known I was asking. My hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, and sweat was running down my back, despite the October chill seeping through my partially open window. Every rational part of my mind was telling me to keep driving, to get to Great Falls and civilization, and lights and people who could tell me I wasn't losing my sanity on this empty highway. But another part of me, a part that seemed to be growing stronger with every mile, wanted to pull over and walk out into that darkness where the siren sang its impossible song. As we crested a particularly steep hill, the lights of Great Falls finally appeared in the distance, a warm yellow glow against the northern horizon that looked like salvation itself. The moment those lights came into view, the siren began to fade, not gradually, but in sudden steps, as if someone were turning down a volume control in discrete increments. The shimmer in the darkness flickered once more and vanished. The normal night sounds returned all at once. Wind in the grass, the distant rumble of another truck somewhere ahead, the usual electronic chatter crackling back to life on the CB radio. By the time I reached the outskirts of Great Falls, the siren had gone completely silent, leaving me with nothing but my racing heart and the memory of that otherworldly call. I pulled into a truck stop just off the highway, parked under the harsh fluorescent lights, and sat in my cab for a long time, hands shaking as I tried to process what had happened. Other drivers moved around the lot, going about their normal routines, and their very ordinariness was both comforting and somehow disappointing. That something out in the Montana darkness had called to me with a siren that wasn't real, that I'd felt an almost overwhelming urge to abandon everything and walk out into the grasslands toward a sound that couldn't exist. Instead, I delivered my load, took my mandatory rest period, and eventually headed back south on a different route, one that stayed closer to populated areas and well-traveled roads. From Market, it wasn't the usual mechanical whine you'd expect from worn parts, but something deeper, almost like a voice trying to form words through metal and hydraulics. I'd been driving long haul for 15 years, and my rig had never made sounds quite like that before. The service station in Barstow couldn't find anything wrong with it, said the clutch plate looked fine, fluid levels were good, but still that sound persisted every single time I made that shift. Tonight I was hauling a load of furniture from Phoenix to Seattle, running through Nevada on Interstate 80 with nothing but sagebrush and darkness stretching endlessly in every direction. The dashboard clock read 2:17 in the morning, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the humid desert air and the occasional flicker of distant lightning from a storm system moving in from the west. The radio had gone to static about an hour back, leaving me alone with the steady rumble of my diesel engine and that strange sound the clutch made every few minutes, when I had to downshift for a grade or speed up to pass another truck. The noise had been getting more pronounced as the night wore on, and now it genuinely sounded like someone trying to speak, the syllables stretched and distorted but unmistakably vocal. I found myself listening for it, anticipating the moment when I'd need to shift and that grinding voice would emerge from somewhere beneath my feet. Each time it happened, I caught myself holding my breath, straining to make out what it might be trying to say. The rational part of my mind knew it was just metal fatigue, maybe a bearing going bad, or the pressure plate wearing down. But sitting alone in that cab with miles of empty highway ahead, rationality felt pretty thin. Around 3 in the morning I pulled into a truck stop outside of Elko, more to break the monotony than because I needed fuel. The parking lot was half full of sleeping rigs, their running lights creating small pools of red and amber in the darkness. I backed into a spot near the edge of the lot, away from the other trucks, and sat there for a moment with the engine idling. Even at idle, I could hear something unusual coming from the transmission, a low humming that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, almost like breathing or a heartbeat made of machinery. I climbed down from the cab and walked around to the driver's side, crouching near the transmission housing to listen more carefully. The humming was definitely there, emanating from somewhere deep in the drivetrain, and as I pressed my ear closer to the warm metal, I could swear I heard words forming in that mechanical whisper. Help, it seemed to say, then trapped, then something longer that I couldn't quite make out. My hands were shaking as I stood back up, telling myself it was just the caffeine from too much coffee and too many hours on the road. But the voice had sounded so clear, so human, buried there in the machinery. Back in the cab, I tried to rest for a few minutes, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that humming growing louder, more distinct. The words were becoming clearer too, and I realized they weren't random sounds, but part of a conversation, one side of a dialogue, where I could only hear the responses. No, please don't, the clutch seemed to whisper when I started the engine. I can't get out, it said, when I shifted into first gear. It's so dark in here came through when I moved into second, and by the time I was back on the highway, I was convinced that someone or something was trapped inside my transmission, speaking to me through the mechanical components. The storm that had been threatening finally arrived around 4 in the morning, bringing sheets of rain that hammered against my windshield and made the road surface treacherous. I had to slow down considerably, which meant more frequent downshifting, and each time the clutch engaged, the voice became more urgent, more desperate. Listen to me, it pleaded as I dropped down to fourth gear on a steep grade. Don't leave me here, it begged, when I shifted back up as the road leveled out. The words were so clear now that I found myself responding out loud, asking who was there, what they wanted, how I could help them. As I shifted down for a sharp curve, clear as if someone were sitting right next to me, the clutch said, Tommy. My name is Tommy Rodriguez. The name hit me like a physical blow, because I knew exactly who that was. Tommy Rodriguez had been a driver for the same company I worked for, had driven this exact truck before it was assigned to me 3 years ago. He'd disappeared somewhere in Nevada, truck found abandoned on the side of the highway, with no sign of what happened to him. The company had done the paperwork, cleaned out his personal belongings, and put me behind the wheel without ever mentioning the driver who'd vanished. Now Tommy's voice was coming through my clutch, telling me how he'd been trapped somehow in the machinery, conscious and aware but unable to escape, forced to experience every mile, every gear change, every moment of the truck's operation for 3 long years. He described the accident that had somehow fused his essence with the transmission, a late-night breakdown on this same stretch of highway, where something had gone wrong with reality itself, pulling him into the mechanical heart of his rig. The technical details he gave me about the truck's maintenance history, things only the previous driver would know, convinced me this wasn't some stress-induced hallucination. As dawn began to break over the Nevada mountains, Tommy's voice grew more frantic, explaining that he could feel himself fading as the truck aged, that the clutch was finally wearing out, and when it failed completely, whatever remained of him would be lost forever. He begged me to find a way to help him, to somehow separate him from the machinery that had become his prison. But even as he spoke, I could feel the clutch starting to slip, the engagement becoming less reliable, and I knew we didn't have much time before total failure. I pulled over at the next exit, parking in an abandoned gas station that looked like it had been closed for decades. The buildings were weathered and broken, windows boarded up, weeds growing through cracks in the concrete, but something about the place felt familiar, and Tommy's voice confirmed it was where his accident had happened. He guided me through a ritual of sorts, instructing me to disconnect certain cables and ground the transmission housing, while speaking his full name and the date of his disappearance. The process felt surreal, like something from a fever dream. But as I completed each step, the humming from the clutch grew louder and more musical. I shifted through all the gears, and the transmission worked perfectly, smoothly, without any of the grinding or whining that had plagued it before. Tommy was gone, his voice no longer trapped in the machinery, and I wanted to believe I'd somehow helped him find peace. I climbed back into the cab feeling emotionally drained, but satisfied that I'd done the right thing, that I'd helped a fellow driver escape his mechanical purgatory. But as I pulled back onto the highway and accelerated up to cruising speed, preparing to complete my run to Seattle, a new voice emerged from the clutch, different from Tommy's, but just as desperate, just as trapped. "Hello," it whispered, as I shifted into fifth gear. "My name is Sarah Chen, and I've been waiting so long for someone to hear me." The realization hit me that I hadn't freed Tommy at all, but had simply made room for the next voice, the next trapped soul that my truck had somehow collected over the years. And now, as I drive these highways night after night, I listen to Sarah's story, knowing that someday, when my time behind this wheel is done, my own voice might join the chorus speaking through the clutch of whoever drives this rig next. Shadows in the exhaust. The thing about driving a Peterbilt across the Nevada desert at 3 in the morning is that you start seeing patterns in places where patterns shouldn't exist. I've been hauling freight for 17 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything the open road could throw at me. But that night in September changed my understanding of what rides alongside us truckers in the darkness between cities. The load was routine enough. Electronics bound for Reno from a warehouse outside Phoenix. Nothing special about the cargo or the route. My rig was running smooth. That deep diesel purr that becomes as familiar as your own heartbeat after enough years behind the wheel. The night air was cool enough that I could keep the windows cracked, letting the desert wind carry away the stale coffee smell and the faint chemical tang that always seemed to linger around electronics shipments. I was making good time on Interstate 80, running parallel to the Humboldt River through a stretch of Nevada that most people only see in passing, if they see it at all. The landscape out there is beautiful in a stark way, all sand-colored hills rolling away into darkness under a sky so clear you can see stars that city folks forgot existed. But beauty can hide strange things, and emptiness has a way of making room for whatever wants to fill it. The first time I noticed something odd, I was about 30 miles east of Winnemucca, cruising at a steady 70 in the right lane. A glance in my passenger side mirror showed my exhaust plume trailing behind me, gray-white in the moonlight, dispersing into the night air like it should. But there was something else mixed in with that familiar diesel smoke, something that moved differently, with more purpose than the random swirling of exhaust gases. You spend enough hours watching mirrors and you learn not to trust every flicker and movement you think you see. The mind plays games when you're tired, manufactures motion where there isn't any, creates faces and cloud formations and figures in tree lines. So I looked away, focused on the road ahead, and forgot about it for a while. But the feeling lingered, that subtle unease that crawls up your spine when you sense eyes on you. I found myself checking the passenger mirror more frequently, stealing glances at my exhaust trail, and each time I looked, that wrongness seemed more pronounced, as if something was indeed moving within the gray plume, something that didn't belong there. No other traffic shared the road with me, just the steady rhythm of my engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. Radio chatter was minimal, just the distant voices of other drivers scattered across the western states, their conversations fading in and out with atmospheric conditions. It was during one of these quiet stretches that I got a clearer look at what was happening behind me. A long straight section of highway allowed me to adjust my mirrors properly, and in the steady moonlight, I could see my exhaust trail clearly. The diesel smoke rose and dispersed as it should, but within it, darker shapes moved with deliberate motion, forming and reforming like ink dropped in water, but too organized, too purposeful to be random. I downshifted and let my speed drop, thinking maybe the change in RPM would affect whatever optical illusion I was experiencing. The shapes in my exhaust responded, but not the way smoke should respond to changing engine conditions. Instead, they seemed to grow more defined, more aggressive in their movements, as if my slower speed gave them opportunity to manifest more clearly. They were shadows, but shadows cast by nothing I could see, shadows that moved independently of any light source, weaving through my exhaust plume like swimmers in murky water. Some were long and serpentine, others more compact and purposeful, but all of them seemed aware of my attention, seemed to respond when I watched them in the mirror. I reached for my CB radio, thinking to ask if any other drivers in the area were seeing anything unusual, but the static that came through the speaker was wrong, filled with whispers and susurrus sounds that almost formed words. I clicked through the channels, but every frequency carried the same strange audio, like voices trying to communicate through interference, just below the threshold of comprehension. The shadows in my exhaust were growing bolder now, some of them breaking free from the diesel plume entirely, and flowing alongside my trailer, keeping pace with my rig like outriders in some midnight convoy. They clung to the edges of my mirror's view, always present but never quite centered, never completely clear. When I tried to focus on any individual shadow, it would shift position, slide just out of direct observation while others moved in to take its place. My engine temperature was normal, my exhaust system showing no warning lights, but the diesel smoke pouring from my stacks seemed heavier now, more substantial, providing better camouflage for whatever was riding with me through the Nevada night. I could feel their presence like a weight pressing against the walls of my cab, seeking entry, testing the boundaries of the physical world. A sign for a truck stop appeared in my headlights, promising fuel and food and the comfort of other human beings. But as I began to slow for the exit, the shadows in my exhaust became agitated, swirling more violently, and some of them moved forward along the length of my trailer, approaching the cab. In my mirrors they looked like dark liquid flowing uphill, defying physics and common sense. I gunned the engine and stayed on the interstate, afraid of what might happen if I stopped, afraid the shadows might find their way inside my truck if I gave them the opportunity. They settled back into their positions around my exhaust plume, but I could sense their disappointment, their frustration, like heat radiating from asphalt on a summer day. Mile markers passed in a blur as I maintained speed, desperate to reach Winnemucca and the safety of lights and people. But the shadows were growing stronger, more numerous, and my diesel exhaust was becoming a gray river behind me, heavy with dark passengers that had not been there when I left Phoenix. Some of them were large enough now that they blocked stars as they moved, creating moving gaps in the desert sky. The radio crackled with those same whispered voices, and this time I caught fragments of words, phrases that might have been my name, directions that might have been instruction. The shadows along my trailer began moving in rhythm with the voices, as if responding to commands I couldn't fully understand. Then, just as panic began to overwhelm my trucker's instinct to stay calm and keep moving, the lights of Winnemucca appeared on the horizon. The moment those distant sodium vapor lights became visible, the shadows in my exhaust began to fade, retreating deeper into the diesel smoke, becoming less distinct, less purposeful. By the time I reached the first streetlight on the edge of town, my mirrors showed nothing but normal exhaust dispersion, gray smoke rising and dissipating in the night air. I pulled into the first truck stop I found and shut down my engine, sitting in the sudden silence and trying to process what I had experienced. Other trucks idled nearby, their familiar sounds a comfort after the strange whispers on my radio. I walked around my rig, inspecting the exhaust stacks, looking for any sign of what had been riding with me, but found nothing unusual, just the normal residue of diesel combustion and road dust. But even now, months later, I find myself watching my mirrors more carefully on those long, empty stretches of highway, because I know they're still out there, those shadows that swim in exhaust plumes, waiting for the right conditions, the right isolation, the right moment to emerge from wherever such things hide during daylight hours. And sometimes, on the darkest nights in the most remote place, I still catch glimpses of them in my peripheral vision, patient and persistent, following the gray rivers that flow from every diesel stack across America's highways, content to wait for their chance to ride with us again through the spaces between cities, in the hours when the living world grows thin and other things find room to exist. The mark of what once was. From Marcus. I've been hauling freight for 15 years now, my Peterbilt 37.9, and I covering every mile of asphalt between the coasts. But there's something about this particular stretch that always makes me grip the wheel a little tighter. Maybe it's the way the wind cuts across those endless plains, or how the radio seems to lose its signal right around mile marker 2067, leaving nothing but static and the steady rumble of my diesel engine for company. It was pushing 2 in the morning when I first noticed the handprint on the inside of my passenger window. At first I figured it was mine. Maybe I'd pressed my palm against the glass during my last fuel stop, checking for cracks or scratches the way drivers do when they're killing time. But as the headlights of an eastbound semi swept across my cab, illuminating the interior for just a moment, I could see that the print was too small to be mine. The fingers were delicate, almost childlike, and they were pressed against the glass from the inside, as if someone had been sitting in my passenger seat, desperately trying to get out. The strange thing was, I always keep my doors locked when I'm on the road, especially during these late-night hauls through the middle of nowhere. It's just common sense in this business, and I hadn't given anyone a ride in months. Company policy strictly forbids picking up hitchhikers, not that you see many out here in the wheat country anyway. I tried to convince myself it was just condensation playing tricks with my eyes, the way moisture can form patterns that look almost too purposeful to be random. But every time I glanced over at that passenger window, the handprints seemed to catch what little light filtered through the cab, standing out like a pale ghost against the dark glass. You know that sensation when you're alone in a house and you suddenly get the overwhelming certainty that you're not actually alone at all? That's what was creeping up my spine as I watched that handprint in my peripheral vision. The print itself wasn't moving, but somehow it felt alive, like it was watching me drive, waiting for something I couldn't name. The air conditioning was running steady, but the cab felt stuffy, almost warm, as if an extra body was generating heat somewhere in the sleeper compartment behind me. I reached for the radio, hoping to find some late-night talk show to fill the silence, but all I got was that peculiar static that seems to follow you through certain dead zones. Even CB Channel 19 was quiet, which was unusual for a Friday night. Truckers are night owls by nature, and there's usually someone chattering about road conditions or speed traps, but tonight the airwaves were empty except for the soft hiss of white noise. I turned the radio off and focused on the road ahead, where my headlights carved a tunnel of visibility through the darkness, revealing nothing but more asphalt and the occasional reflective marker post. It was so faint at first that I thought it might be the engine developing a new rhythm, or maybe debris caught in the wheel wells. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it was coming from inside the cab. Soft, deliberate taps against glass, following no particular pattern but definitely intentional. I glanced at the passenger window again, and my blood went cold. There were now 2 handprints pressed against the inside surface, both small, both positioned as if someone was sitting in the passenger seat with their palms flat against the glass. Maybe the prints had been there all along and I'd just noticed the second one. Maybe the changing angle of my headlights was revealing marks that had always existed. But deep down, in that primitive part of the brain that kept our ancestors alive when things went bump in the night, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with my truck. The cab felt occupied, crowded in a way that had nothing to do with the freight I was hauling, or the personal items scattered around the driver's area. I decided to pull over at the next truck stop, maybe grab a coffee and inspect the cab with a flashlight, see if I could figure out what was causing these phantom handprints. But when I checked my GPS, the nearest services were still 30 miles ahead, and something told me I didn't want to stop on the shoulder in the middle of this vast, empty stretch of Kansas. The darkness beyond my headlights felt too complete, too hungry, as if it was waiting for me to kill the engine and step outside where the wheat rustled with sounds that weren't quite wind. Mile marker 260 flashed by, then 259, and with each passing marker the tapping grew more insistent. Now it sounded like multiple small hands drumming against various windows throughout the cab, the passenger side, the sleeper compartment, even the windshield directly in front of me. But every time I looked directly at a window, I saw only those original handprints, pale and small and somehow desperate. The temperature gauge was reading normal, but sweat was beading on my forehead, and I had to resist the urge to crank up the air conditioning. Something told me that making any sudden changes to the cab's environment might be a very bad idea. But instead of a trucker's voice, all that came through the speaker was the sound of breathing. Slow, shallow breaths that sounded too young, too small to belong to anyone who should be on the CB frequency. I grabbed the handset, keyed the mic, and said, "Breaker, breaker. This is the Blue Pete heading west on I-70. You got your ears on?" The breathing stopped, replaced by silence so complete it seemed to absorb sound rather than simply lacking it. Then, just before I was about to try again, a voice whispered through the static, not a child's voice, but something pretending to be a child, something that understood the shape of words but not their warmth. I dropped the handset like it had caught fire, my heart hammering against my ribs as I checked the mirrors for any sign of other vehicles. The highway stretched empty in both directions, nothing but my trailer's marker lights reflecting back at me from the dark. But now there were handprints on the inside of my driver's side window too, small palms pressed against the glass, as if a group of children were trapped inside the cab, trying to signal to the outside world. The logical part of my mind noted that this was impossible. I was sitting right there. I would have seen anyone climbing into the cab, but logic felt like a thin shield against whatever was happening in my truck. The next exit was 5 miles ahead, a small rural interchange that probably led to nothing but farm roads and grain elevators. But at that moment it seemed like salvation. I pushed the Peterbilt harder, watching the speedometer climb, as the tapping against the windows intensified, becoming a frantic drumming that seemed to echo my own racing pulse. In the passenger seat, something shifted. Not visible, but I felt the subtle change in weight distribution that comes when someone adjusts their position. The air grew thick with the scent of wheat fields, and something else, something like rain on hot asphalt, even though the night was clear and dry. As I took the exit ramp, my headlights swept across a small roadside memorial, one of those white crosses decorated with artificial flowers that mark where someone lost their life to the highway. This one was different though. Instead of a single cross, there were several small ones, child-sized, arranged in a semicircle beside a weathered sign that read, "School Bus." The moment my lights hit those crosses, every handprint in my cab pressed harder against the glass, and the CB radio erupted with the sound of children's voices, all talking at once, all asking the same question, "Can you take us home?" I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I got back on the highway and drove straight through to Denver, not stopping for fuel, not stopping for food, not stopping for anything until I reached the truck yard, where bright fluorescent lights and the sounds of civilization could chase away whatever had been riding with me through the Kansas night. In the morning light I searched every inch of my cab, but found no trace of the handprints, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. And on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the highway stretches endless ahead, I swear I can still hear that soft tapping against the glass, patient and persistent, as if those small hands are still searching for someone to take them home. I've been running freight through the Pacific Northwest for going on 23 years now, and I thought I'd seen every kind of weather these mountains could throw at a drive. Rain that felt like bullets against your windshield, snow so thick you couldn't see your own hood ornament, wind that tried to push your rig clean off the interstate. But what I encountered on Highway 1 that October night was something else entirely, something that still makes my hands shake when the fog rolls in, thick around my home in Portland. I was hauling a load of electronics from Seattle down to San Francisco, running about 2 hours behind schedule because of a delayed pickup. My dispatcher had been breathing down my neck about delivery times, so when the fog started creeping in around Olympia, I made the decision to push through instead of pulling over to wait it out like I probably should have. The weather report said it would clear by midnight, and I figured I could make up some time on the empty stretches through the coastal mountain. My Peterbilt's headlights cut through the mist like twin swords at first, illuminating the familiar ribbon of asphalt and the reflective lane markers that had guided me safely through countless nights. The fog wasn't unusual for this stretch of road, where the marine layer rolled in from the Pacific and got trapped in the valleys between the hills. I'd driven through worse, or so I told myself as I adjusted my CB radio and settled in for what I expected to be a slow but manageable journey south. The first hour went smoothly enough. My diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby, and the rhythmic thump of my tires over expansion joints created a steady percussion that usually helped me stay alert during long hauls. I had a thermos of coffee still warm from the truck stop, and a playlist of classic country keeping me company through the cab speakers. Occasionally another set of headlights would materialize from the opposite direction, and we'd pass each other like ships in the night, our lights briefly illuminating the swirling gray walls that seemed to press closer to the road with each passing mile. But somewhere around the tiny logging town of McCleary, I started to notice that the fog wasn't behaving quite right. Instead of the usual random swirls and eddies that you'd expect from normal mist, there seemed to be a pattern to its movement, almost like it was flowing with purpose rather than just drifting on the air currents. At first I chalked it up to the geography of the area, figuring the hills and valleys were channeling the fog in ways that created these strange, almost serpentine movements just beyond my headlight beam. I turned up the radio a bit and took another sip of coffee, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was starting to creep up my spine. The caffeine helped sharpen my focus, but it also seemed to make me more aware of the subtle wrongness in the way the fog moved around my truck. It wasn't just flowing past anymore, it seemed to be keeping pace with me, maintaining the same distance from my headlights, no matter how I adjusted my speed. When I accelerated on a straight stretch, it seemed to surge forward as well, always staying just at the edge of visibility. The rational part of my mind knew this had to be some kind of optical illusion, maybe caused by fatigue or the hypnotic effect of staring into the mist for too long, but I couldn't shake the growing certainty that something in that gray wall was watching me. It was just past the town of Elma when I first saw what might have been a face. The fog had grown so thick that I'd reduced my speed to barely 30 miles per hour, my hazard lights blinking as I crept along the right edge of the highway. My headlights seemed to be losing their effectiveness, as if the mist was somehow absorbing the light rather than reflecting it back. That's when I caught a glimpse of what looked like human features formed in the swirling gray mass about 50 feet ahead of my truck. At first it was just a vague suggestion of eyes and a mouth, the kind of shape your brain might impose on random patterns when you're tired and stressed. But as I drew closer, the features became more distinct, more deliberately formed. Two dark hollows that could have been eye sockets, a gaping opening below them that resembled a mouth frozen in a silent scream. The face appeared to be enormous, easily 20 feet across, formed from the fog itself, but maintaining a consistency that defied the natural movement of mist in the night air. When I looked again, the face seemed to have dissolved back into ordinary fog, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. I reached for my CB radio, thinking I'd check in with other drivers on the channel, but all I got was static. Even the local AM stations had faded to nothing but white noise, as if the fog was interfering with radio signals as well as light. I turned off the radio rather than listen to the static, and in that sudden quiet, I became aware of another sound that seemed to be coming from outside the truck. It was subtle at first, almost inaudible over the road noise, but gradually I realized I was hearing what sounded like breathing, slow and rhythmic, as if something enormous was drawing breath in perfect time with my engine's idle. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to convince myself that I was hearing things, that the sound was just wind moving through the fog, or maybe an echo of my own breathing amplified by the enclosed space of the cab. But the rhythm was too regular, too deliberate, and it seemed to be coming from all around my truck rather than from any single direction. The features were clearer now, more defined, and undeniably intentional. The eyes were dark voids that seemed to reflect my headlights back at me, while the mouth had formed into what looked like a smile, though there was nothing warm or welcoming about the expression. It was the kind of smile that suggested hunger, or anticipation of something unpleasant about to happen. I hit the brakes instinctively, bringing my rig to a complete stop in the middle of the highway. The face in the fog didn't dissipate or drift away as I'd expect. Instead, it remained perfectly still, as if it were painted on a wall rather than formed from shifting mist. Those hollow eyes seemed to be studying me through my windshield, and I had the horrible sensation that whatever intelligence was behind them could see me as clearly as I could see it. The breathing sound grew louder, more pronounced, and I realized with growing horror that it was synchronized with the expansion and contraction of the foggy features in front of me. Each inhalation caused the face to grow slightly larger, more solid-looking, while each exhalation made it fade just a bit before reforming even more distinctly than before. I tried to back up, but when I shifted into reverse and pressed the accelerator, my truck wouldn't move. The engine responded normally, RPMs climbing as I pressed harder on the pedal, but it was as if something was holding the entire rig in place. Through my mirrors I could see that fog had closed in behind me as well, forming what looked suspiciously like massive hands pressed against my trailer doors. The face in front of me began to change, the mouth opening wider, revealing what might have been teeth formed from wisps of darker gray mist. The breathing sound became more like a whisper, and though I couldn't make out distinct words, the tone was unmistakably threatening, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey and was savoring the moment before striking. I gunned the engine harder, feeling my truck rock slightly, but still unable to move forward or backward. The fog pressed closer from all sides now, and I could see more faces beginning to form in the mist around my cab, smaller than the first, but no less menacing. Some appeared to be screaming, others laughing, and a few wore expressions of such profound sadness that looking at them made my chest ache with inexplicable grief. Without really thinking about why it might help, I reached up and pulled the cord, sending a blast of sound echoing through the night. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The faces dissolved instantly, the fog recoiled as if physically struck, and suddenly I could move again. I didn't hesitate. I shifted into drive and floored the accelerator, my truck lurching forward as the fog parted reluctantly around me. For the next 10 minutes I drove as fast as I dared through the dissipating mist, laying on the air horn every few seconds to keep the fog at bay. Each blast seemed to clear a wider path ahead of me, and gradually I began to see stars through the... You know how it is out on these endless highways, mile after mile of asphalt stretching into the darkness. Nothing but the steady rumble of diesel and the hypnotic sweep of your own headlights painting white lines on black pavement. Sometimes your mind starts playing tricks on you, showing you things that aren't really there. At least, that's what I told myself that first night on Interstate 40, somewhere between Flagstaff and Albuquerque. The October air was crisp and thin at that elevation, with just enough bite to keep me alert as my 18-wheeler carved through the high desert darkness. My Peterbilt 37.9 was loaded heavy with auto parts bound for Houston, and she was running smooth as silk, that big Caterpillar engine purring like a contented beast beneath the long hood. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, but mostly it was just me and the road, the way I liked it. The dashboard lights cast a soft green glow across the cab, and the gentle vibration of the truck settling into its rhythm was almost meditative. I'd been driving since dawn, putting nearly 700 miles behind me, and my logbook said I had maybe 2 hours left before I'd need to find a place to rest. The digital clock on the dash showed 11:47 p.m., and traffic was sparse. Just the occasional set of taillights disappearing over the next ridge or an oncoming truck throwing brief shadows as we passed each other in the night. The radio was playing some late-night talk show, the host's voice a comforting drone that mixed with the steady hiss of air brakes and the whisper of tires on asphalt. That's when I first noticed them in my mirrors, those strange floating lights that would change everything I thought I knew about the road. At first glance they looked like headlights, two bright circles of white light maybe a quarter mile behind me, but something about them didn't sit right. They were too high off the ground, too perfectly round, and they seemed to drift slightly from side to side as if they weren't quite anchored to anything solid. I adjusted my mirrors thinking maybe the glass had gotten knocked out of alignment, but the lights remained unchanged, maintaining that same eerie distance behind my trailer. Normal headlights would bounce and sway with the movement of the vehicle carrying them, would dim and brighten as they crested hills or dipped into valleys, would show the telltale signs of being part of something mechanical and earthbound. These lights did none of that. They glided with an unnatural smoothness, never getting closer, never falling behind, just floating there in the darkness, like two pale eyes watching my every move. Maybe it was some new kind of vehicle I hadn't seen before, something experimental or foreign. Maybe atmospheric conditions were playing tricks with the light, creating some kind of optical illusion. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, and my depth perception was off. But even as I ran through these explanations, I knew they didn't feel right. In over 2 decades of night driving, I'd seen all kinds of unusual things on the road, from military convoys hauling classified equipment, to prototype vehicles covered in camouflage, and none of them had ever given me the creeping sense of wrongness that these floating lights inspired. I tried adjusting my speed, slowing down to 60, then 55, hoping whatever was behind me would overtake, and I could get a proper look at it. The lights maintained their distance perfectly, neither gaining nor losing ground. I sped up to 70, pushing my rig harder than I liked on these winding mountain curves, but still the lights matched my pace with that same eerie precision. It was as if they were tethered to me somehow, bound to follow at exactly that distance, no matter what I did. The CB radio erupted with static, and for a moment I thought I might hear another driver mentioning the strange lights. But when the interference cleared, the channel was silent except for the usual background chatter from distant cities. I keyed the microphone and called out, asking if anyone else could see what was behind me, but got no response except my own voice echoing back through the speaker. The isolation of the moment settled around me like a cold blanket, and I realized I was truly alone out here with whatever was following me through the night. The lights cast no illumination on the road's surface or the surrounding landscape, threw no reflected glow off my trailer or the guardrails we passed. They simply existed as 2 points of cold light, hanging in the darkness, defying every law of physics I understood. When other vehicles approached from behind, their headlights would sometimes pass directly through the space where the floating lights hovered, and neither set seemed to affect the other. It was as if they existed in different layers of reality, occupying the same space, but somehow never touching. The desert landscape began to change as we climbed higher into the mountains, the scrub brush giving way to stands of pine and aspen that crowded close to the highway. The road twisted through narrow canyons where the walls rose steeply on both sides, cutting off most of the sky and creating a tunnel of darkness that my headlights could barely penetrate. In these tight spaces, the floating lights seemed to grow brighter, more defined, and I began to make out subtle details that chilled me to the bone. They weren't perfectly round as I'd first thought, but slightly elongated, like eyes that were watching me with patient intensity. Sometimes they would pulse almost imperceptibly, a slow rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of breathing or a heartbeat. In my side mirrors I could see them adjust their position whenever I changed lanes, always maintaining that perfect trailing distance, always keeping me centered in their unwavering gaze. The temperature outside had dropped considerably as we climbed, and I could see my breath forming small clouds of vapor when I exhaled. The heater was running full blast, but somehow the cab felt cold, as if the presence behind me was drawing warmth from the very air. My hands began to shake slightly as I gripped the steering wheel, whether from cold or fear I couldn't say. The radio had dissolved into static again, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the increasingly labored rumble of the engine as it worked against the steep grade. That's when the lights began to move closer. It happened so gradually that at first I thought I was imagining it, but over the course of several miles I could see them growing larger in my mirrors, their pale glow becoming more intense. The distance that had remained constant for over an hour was slowly shrinking, and with it came a mounting sense of dread that settled in my stomach like a lead weight. Whatever these things were, they were tired of simply following. They were coming for me. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my rig beyond safe speeds for these mountain curves, but the lights continued their steady approach. They were close enough now that I could see they cast the faintest shadow on my trailer doors, a shadow that moved and shifted in ways that made no sense given that they were supposedly just floating points of light. The shadow had substance, had depth, had the suggestion of something vast and terrible lurking just beyond the edge of visibility. At least there would be lights there, other people, witnesses to whatever was about to happen. But as soon as I activated my turn signal, the floating lights suddenly surged forward with impossible speed, closing the distance in seconds until they filled my mirrors with their cold radiance. The cab of my truck was flooded with pale light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I could feel something pressing against the back of my mind, a presence vast and alien that regarded me with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying an insect. The steering wheel grew ice cold under my hands, and frost began forming on the inside of the windshield despite the heater running at full power. The engine began to sputter and miss, as if the strange presence was somehow interfering with its operation. Then, just as suddenly as they had approached, the lights pulled back and vanished entirely, leaving me alone in the sudden darkness with nothing but the familiar glow of my own headlights and the comforting rumble of the diesel engine. I sat there for several minutes, heart pounding, waiting for them to return, but the road behind me remained empty. The truck stop appeared ahead right on schedule, its neon signs and sodium vapor lights painting the night in familiar colors of commerce and humanity. I pulled into the parking area and shut down the engine, my hands still trembling as I climbed down from the cab. The lot was busy with other drivers fueling up or taking their mandatory rest breaks, and the sight of normal people going about their normal routines helped steady my nerves somewhat. I walked around the station that watches back. Dickie Schraff. From Marcus Wheeler. I've been hauling freight across the interstate for 23 years, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen every kind of gas station there was to see. The gleaming corporate chains with their blazing LED signs, the family-owned mom-and-pop stops with hand-painted advertisements peeling off their walls, and the forgotten relics slowly surrendering to rust and time. But I'd never encountered anything quite like the Crossroads Junction station until that foggy November night, when my fuel gauge needle kissed the red zone somewhere between Bakersfield and Fresno. The fog had rolled in thick around 10:30, transforming the familiar highway into an alien landscape where my headlights seemed to die just a few yards ahead of my Kenworth's chrome bumper. I'd been nursing the tank for the last 40 miles, hoping to make it to the truck stop I knew waited at the next major exit. But the diesel was running thin, and my engine was starting to develop that subtle hesitation that meant trouble was brewing. When I spotted the soft glow of neon bleeding through the mist ahead, I felt that familiar relief wash over me, even though something in the back of my mind whispered that I didn't remember seeing a station at this particular mile marker before. The place materialized out of the fog like something from another era, all vintage curves and retro styling that belonged more to the 1950s than the modern world. The building sat squat and rounded, painted in faded turquoise and cream, with a pair of old-fashioned pumps standing sentinel beneath a wide canopy that cast everything in a sickly yellow light. A neon sign buzzed and flickered overhead, spelling out Crossroads Junction in letters that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, and beneath it a smaller sign promised gas, food, lodging, though I couldn't see any evidence of the latter two amenities in the swirling mist. I pulled my rig up to the diesel pump, grateful to see that they'd at least updated the fuel dispensers to accept modern payment methods, though everything else about the place seemed frozen in time. The silence that settled over me when I shut down the engine felt unnaturally complete, as if the fog had swallowed not just the sounds of the distant highway, but every cricket, every night bird, every whisper of wind through the surrounding landscape. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled as I climbed down from the cab, the familiar crunch of gravel beneath my boots strangely distant and hollow. That's when I first noticed the feeling of being watched, though I couldn't immediately pinpoint the source of my unease. It started as just a tickle between my shoulder blades, the kind of sensation you get when someone's staring at you from across a crowded room. I glanced around, expecting to see an attendant emerging from the station's glass-fronted office, or perhaps another traveler filling up at the regular gas pumps on the other side of the island. But the place appeared completely deserted. The office windows glowed with warm yellow light, and I could make out the shapes of merchandise on shelves and a display case near what looked like an old-fashioned cash register, but no human figures moved within. As I worked to fuel my truck, unscrewing the cap and wrestling with the surprisingly heavy nozzle, that feeling of observation only grew stronger. It seemed to emanate from the building itself, as if the structure possessed some form of awareness that tracked my every movement. I found myself glancing repeatedly at the office windows, certain I'd glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision, but each time I looked directly, I saw only the static arrangement of products and the gentle sway of what might have been a hanging air freshener or small sign. The fuel pump ran slower than modern dispensers, with an irregular rhythm that sounded almost like labored breathing in the fog-muffled silence. I tried to occupy my mind by studying the station's architecture, noting the careful attention to period detail in everything from the rounded corners of the building to the vintage-style font used on the various signs and advertisements. Someone had gone to considerable expense to create this throwback atmosphere, though I couldn't imagine why anyone would choose such an isolated location for what was clearly meant to be a nostalgic dining or tourist destination. It was while I was examining a faded advertisement for some long-discontinued motor oil that I realized what was wrong with the window. At first glance they appeared perfectly normal, reflecting the yellow light from the canopy and the red glow of my truck's running lights in a way that suggested ordinary glass. But as I watched more carefully, I began to notice that the reflections didn't quite align with reality. When I raised my hand to scratch my beard, the movement appeared in the windows a split second before I actually made it. When I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, my reflection seemed to anticipate the motion, starting to move before my body did. The fuel nozzle finally clicked off, indicating a full tank, but my hands felt strangely reluctant to release it and return it to its cradle. Something about completing the transaction felt like crossing a threshold I wasn't prepared to navigate, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. I forced myself to go through the motions, hanging up the nozzle and securing my fuel cap, while that sensation of being observed intensified to an almost physical pressure against my skin. I knew I should simply climb back into my cab and drive away, but the same impulse that makes you slow down to look at accident scenes compelled me to walk toward the office. I told myself I wanted to pay with cash rather than leave a credit card trail, or perhaps buy a cup of coffee for the road, but honestly, I think I needed to prove to myself that there were ordinary human beings inside that building, that the strange reflections and unsettling atmosphere had rational explanation. The glass door opened with a soft chime, and I stepped into an interior that was even more meticulously detailed than the exterior. Every surface gleamed with vintage authenticity, from the checkerboard linoleum floor to the curved chrome edges of the display case. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with an array of snacks and automotive supplies that seemed to span several decades, as if someone had been restocking the same inventory for 50 years without ever rotating the older items out. The air held a mixture of aromas that should have been comfort coffee and fried food, and that particular scent of old paper and cleaning supplies that defines small-town convenience stores. But somehow the combination felt off, like a photograph that's been retouched until it ventures into uncanny valley territory. Behind the counter stood a man who might have been 30 or 60, with the kind of ageless quality that comes from a lifetime of routine and predictable days. His hair was slicked back with pomade, and he wore a uniform shirt with Earl embroidered over the pocket, though his smile seemed painted on rather than genuine. When he spoke, his voice had that same too-perfect quality as the rest of the place, friendly and accommodating in a way that felt rehearsed rather than natural. "Evening, friend," he said, and his eyes reflected the overhead lights in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the strange behavior I'd noticed in the windows. "Hope you found everything you needed out there. Beautiful night for traveling, isn't it? Though I suppose the fog makes things a bit challenging for you professional drivers." His conversation felt scripted, hitting all the expected notes of casual interaction without any of the spontaneous elements that mark genuine human communication. When I mentioned that I didn't remember seeing his station on previous trips through this area, his smile widened in a way that didn't reach those strangely reflective eyes. "Oh, we've been here longer than most people remember," he said, and something in his tone made the hair on my arms stand up. "Folks tend to find us exactly when they need to, if you understand my meaning. Safe travels now, and don't be a stranger." I left the office with relief flooding through my veins, eager to put distance between myself and Earl's unsettling hospitality. But as I walked back toward my truck, I noticed that the fog seemed to have thickened even further, creating a wall of gray-white opacity that extended just beyond the edges of the station's light. My Kenworth sat exactly where I'd left it, but somehow it appeared smaller than before, as if the pervading mist had pressed in around it like some living thing. If anything, it had grown stronger, and now it seemed to emanate from multiple directions at once. I spun slowly in place, scanning the fog-shrouded perimeter of the station, and caught glimpses of shapes that might have been people standing just beyond the reach of the light, perfectly still and silent as monuments. When I tried to focus on any individual figure, it would seem to dissolve back into the mist, but in my peripheral vision, I could sense them gathering, forming a loose circle around the entire facility.